Hi everyone, we hope you're doing well. We're hanging in there though honestly, we haven't been getting much sleep lately. Today, we want to answer a question we get a lot: how do we publish our audiobooks? First, we post most audiobooks on Patreon as paid content. They stay paid for a few months. After that, they become free to listen to on Patreon forever. A few weeks later, we post them on other places like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, X. Lately, things have been a bit slow in terms of new members. So we'd love your help. Please share our site with your friends or in places like Facebook groups, Twitter, X, Discord, Reddit, or novel forums. Even one share can really help us grow. Thanks so much for your support, and informed him of just what he had witnessed happen on this day. Not that he needed to, for the moment Eric had emerged victorious in the unwinnable scenario, the entire Admiralty had been alerted of the incident. As for Eric, the number on his uniform's breast pocket had suddenly dropped from nearly the bottom of the leaderboard, which was the result of his repeated failures that had suffered these past 6 months because of realism mode, to rank 97. After accomplishing the impossible, he had jumped straight into the top 100 cadets at the Naval Academy on Germania, meaning he was within the top 100 naval cadets in the entire empire. The moment after Eric had stopped celebrating, and stepped out of the holodeck, he found himself surrounded by several instructors, including the admiral tasked with leading the academy. There was a stern look on the man's face as he spit a barrage of questions at the young man who was standing in front of him. How the hell did you win? You can't win. It's not designed to be beaten. You must have cheated somehow. Eric looked away awkwardly as he heard this accusation. While what he did could be considered cheating, and probably was in the eyes of most people. However, it wasn't explicitly mentioned against the rules. After all, as long as he did not interfere with the direct outcome of the scenario, he could use his cyberkinesis to some extent, and thus he admitted to what he had done, rather than try to conceal it. I simply used my ability to manipulate the parameters that would allow me to convince the admiral on board the carrier to equip my heavy bomber with a planet killer. Which according to the AI which runs the program, that was not considered cheating. It took me half a day, just to convince the stubborn old goat to allow me to do so, but once I did, I was able to load a planet killer on my bomber, and all that was left was the matter of getting within such a short distance of the enemy hive ship, that it was impossible to miss. I figured that the only way to win in such an impossible scenario is for each man to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the Empire. Thus, after a particularly rousing speech, I had the comrades in my wing clear a way for me to get close enough to launch my torpedo into the hangar bay of the hive ship which contained the Queen. Which I had discovered the identity of after a particularly brutal death roughly 2 weeks ago. Honestly, I did not even know if the Hive Queen would be on the same ship, so it was really a matter of luck as to whether or not I succeeded. The Admiral stared in disbelief at Eric after he heard just how the young man had managed to accomplish something that no cadet had succeeded in doing over the past 400 years. Even after hearing this explanation, the Admiral determined that it was a feat that required a hell of a lot of planning and a certain degree of luck to pull off. However, even though Eric tampered with the parameters of the simulation, to allow him to convince the Admiral to accept such a harebrained, desperate, and suicidal scheme, he had not actually interfered with anything that would not be realistic in such a desperate situation. In fact, he had not even forced the Admiral to agree to his request, and had spent half a day of attempts just to get the man to agree. This required not only effective communication skills, but solid reasoning, and a hell of a lot of charisma. And thus, while many people would believe that Eric had, in fact, cheated, he had only really bent the rules in a way which was still considered acceptable by the Admiralty. Which was immediately confirmed by the recordings of his last 6 months' worth of attempts on this scenario. This left the Admiral in a state of total shock, and thus he could only say a single word, which was also the question he wanted to know the answer to most of all. Why? It was now Eric's turn to be shocked. Why would he go through so much effort just to beat an unwinnable scenario? Because even if it was designed to result in nothing but failure, it was still a very real possibility which the Empire could one day face. And knowing this, Eric would be remiss if he did not find a way to emerge victorious, thus he was quick to voice this belief, which seemed so obvious to him, yet so alien to everyone else. Isn't it obvious? Because it is my duty to do so. Self-sacrifice is the first principle of civilization. No matter how unified the Germanic people may be as a race, and despite the fact that individualism had been effectively stamped out of their society through a lifetime of collectivist propaganda, the Germanic race was still an offshoot of humanity, and because of this, everyone was still selfish at the end of the day. And though it was possible to be cloned into another body with all of your memories intact upon death, mankind would instinctively avoid their deaths, even if it came at the expense of their entire civilization. Thus, for Eric to blatantly say it was his duty to sacrifice himself for the good of his people, after displaying such a willingness to do so, even if it was a simulation, This had caused all the naval officers standing in front of him who had witnessed these words to suddenly feel like a bunch of frauds. Chapter 13, A One-Sided Vendetta. Nobody could have predicted how far the simulation footage of Eric's unparalleled accomplishment would spread across the Empire. Perhaps it was the act of the lieutenant who ran the simulation, but almost immediately after achieving a victory in an unwinnable scenario, the footage was leaked to the grid. All across the Empire people were commenting on the feat that nobody had managed to accomplish in the entire history of the Empire, at least not until this moment. The comments ranged from discussions about Eric's status as a mutant, to accusations of cheating the system, and even some praise for his heroic actions. For those who had also taken part in the realistic difficulty of the scenario, they were quite shocked at the sheer force of will that Eric had displayed with his actions. Most men would quit after one attempt at realism mode, yet Eric had continued to take part in the simulation for months on end, until he had achieved victory. Naturally, these men sung their praise as loud, and often as they could manage. It did not take long before Eric was identified as the son of a sector governor, one on the frontier of the Empire's borders. The name Eric Yeager had spread across the grid like wildfire, but his former peers from high school, who referred to him by his old nickname of Silver, soon drowned it out. However, none of them spoke about how they had bullied Eric in the past. Instead, they all acted as if they were on good terms with the young man who had accomplished the unthinkable. And while Germanic society was fighting amongst itself to determine whether Eric was a cheater or a potential hero in the making, the Admiralty had gathered in a conference call to speak about the young cadet and his astonishing feat. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable, and yet, this one cadet found a way to beat it. We are potentially looking at a future war hero. The admiral who said this was none other than the one tasked with leading the Naval Academy on Germania. Naturally, as the headmaster of the facility, he was a bit biased towards his cadets, and thus he had spoken up on Eric's behalf. But his words were not convincing to the entirety of the conference, as another admiral quickly spoke up in opposition. He clearly cheated the system. By using his cyberkinesis to alter the parameters of the mission, he had made it so he could acquire a weapon that was not supposed to be available to the operator. Retrofitting a planet-killer torpedo onto a heavy bomber? It has never been done before. And while many of the admirals who had gathered to speak about this topic nodded their heads in solidarity with the naysayer, there were those who joined the headmaster in Eric's defense. If he had violated any rules, then the I would have shut down the simulation and alerted the Admiralty. If even the artificial intelligence, whose entire purpose is to manage the holodeck, did not prevent this cadet's actions, then tell me how this is breaking the rules. Not to mention, we have redundancies in place to prevent cheating of any kind. Do I need to remind you that in addition to the I, there is always an officer present to manage the simulation? You should be aware that a lieutenant in charge of the scenario signed off his approval on the cadet's actions, so who are you to disagree? The admirals began to squabble in disagreement. Half of them were in favor of Eric's actions, while the other half were against them. Ultimately, it took the voice of the Grand Admiral to silence the room. His voice carried almost as much weight as the Supreme Leader himself, and thus the moment he began to speak, everyone else immediately ceased their fierce debate and listened to what he had to say. I don't see anything particularly wrong with what this cadet has done. Despite the fact that he used a special ability to alter the simulation's parameters, he did not use them in a way that directly changed the outcome of the scenario. The fact of the matter is, it is entirely possible to outfit a planet-killer torpedo onto several different types of heavy bombers which the Imperial Navy employs, including the one that the aforementioned cadet used in the simulation. Through trial and error, he was able to identify which ship hosted the Hive Queen, something even we are unfamiliar with, which he then proceeded to use his natural charisma to not only convince the simulated admiral to agree to his unconventional idea, but he also managed to persuade the other pilots in his wing to sacrifice themselves so that he had a chance at victory. Realistically speaking, everything he did is entirely possible to achieve in an actual combat scenario, no matter how improbable. The only thing he did which could be considered an act of cheating was modify the parameters of the simulation so it would reflect this reality, something we all failed to consider in advance. The fact that this cadet was even capable of pulling off such a damn near impossible feat in this simulation is a proof that it can be done in the real world. And, in many ways, reflects our own failures to conceive such a strategy. He should be commended for his ingenuity, rather than condemned as a cheater, and I won't hear another word about it. Let the people say whatever they want about his actions, but as far as the Navy is concerned, Cadet Lieutenant Eric Yeager has done nothing wrong. As if they had never dared to voice anything but the opinion that the Grand Admiral had just spoken, those who were once Eric's detractors among the Admiralty immediately switched sides and agreed with their boss. He should be promoted to the rank of Cadet Captain for this feat. We should also teach the tactics he used to emerge victorious in this unwinnable scenario to future generations. Perhaps we should refer to it as the Yeager maneuver? In addition to this, we should also modify the scenario to allow for the use of planet killers, if the operator can obtain the authority to do so through their own means. The conference was in unanimous agreement with this suggestion, that just so happened to come from the lips of a previously opposing admiral. As for the Grand Admiral, he went back to remaining silent, observing the entire situation as he thought about how the weaponization of world killers on heavy bombers could be used to deal with threats that were considerably more powerful than the Imperial Navy. In another corner of the Empire, there was one young woman who was not the slightest bit pleased with the recent discussions that were taking place all across the interstellar network. Erica was biting on her thumb, as she read the comments on her own profile, which were mocking her for insulting Eric. She could not believe that part of the public had so swiftly turned against her, all because some little mutant had beaten a mere simulation. So what if he had done so? It was not like he had actually destroyed a Naraka Hive fleet. All he had done was achieve a victory in what was essentially a glorified video game. And as a result, she was quick to fire back in the comments about how Eric had, in reality, achieved nothing significant. This only further added fuel to the fire of those who were currently flaming her. Her entire fan base was made up of men, and only men could understand how impressive Eric's achievement was, especially those who had actually partaken in the simulation themselves. After all, women were not permitted to join the military, so how could a pampered idol understand the pain which Eric was forced to endure for every defeat he suffered in a scenario? The very fact that he had chosen to endure the pain of death for months on end, in pursuit of an impossible goal, filled the men of the Empire with respect for this young cadet who just so happened to be a mutant. This was something a woman who pranced about on stage for a living could never truly understand. As a result, the young idol had turned off the grid in order to escape the billions of comments which flooded her social media profiles, calling her a naive and foolish little girl. She had to admit, she had never hated anyone more in her life than she did Eric at this very moment. If not for him, those men who were supposed to be her fans would not belittle her in such outrageous ways. It was absolutely infuriating. A fucking mutant had the gall to upstage her. She simply could not tolerate it. Despite the intense animosity she felt towards Eric in this moment, or perhaps because of it, the teenage idol began to dig through his social media to see if she could find anything to use against him. At first, all she saw were pictures of him, in his cadet uniform, which was a dark gray uniform, with a jet black trim, standing alongside his mutant friends while they all messed around at the academy. However, after searching through 6 months' worth of photos, videos, and comments about Eric's life at the Naval Academy, Erica finally found some dirt she could use to besmirch his name. It was a photo taken by the man the night he had first arrived in Germania, where he was standing next to a particularly beautiful Ana woman. In this photo, Eric had one arm wrapped around Yumi's shoulder, as his hand rested on her modest bust. At the same time, he was not wearing a shirt, while chugging a beer that was dangerously close to reaching the 1-liter limit which was imposed upon the Germanic people by the party. The look in Yumi's dark eyes was suggestive, to say the least, as was the sultry expression on her pretty face. And while Erica could not prove that Eric had committed a capital offense in the form of miscegenation, she could make this picture go viral, and leave it up to the Germanic people on how they wished to interpret the image. Thus, she saved the photo before reposting it to her own social media, where she attached every tag she could think of to make it go viral. She also left a particularly spitefully comment, implying that Eric had openly committed multiple felonies in the photo, and should be put to death because of them. Immediately the teenage idol got the response she wanted, as billions of people across the empire saw the photo the moment she reposted it, where they began to question whether the young man who they once believed had the potential to become a hero of the empire was in reality a criminal and a race traitor. With a wide grin on her face, Erica voiced her thoughts aloud. "This is what you get for turning my fans against me, you fucking freak." After realizing that she had voiced some rather spiteful words, Erica looked around the room she currently sat in to make sure that nobody had heard her, before sighing in relief when she realized that she was all alone. For the briefest of moments, Eric knew what it was like to receive the respect of his fellow man, something he had fought his entire life to achieve. However, this did not last long, for shortly thereafter, the entire universe was back to telling him that he should kill himself. Except now there were even quite a few people threatening to kill him for committing the horrific act of racial disgrace, something which the Empire took very seriously. Though there was no way to prove that he had done this, the public had already condemned him simply for a single photo, that on the surface was little more than showing how friendly he was with a foreign diplomat. Thus, at the moment, Eric was sitting in a diner, with the friends he had made at the university, all of which were actually curious whether he had actually fucked the Anna beauty in the photo. Chief among them was Carl, who appeared quite excited about the prospect. "Come on man, please tell me you got it on with that alien babe. You will absolutely be my hero for life if you did." Eric, however, looked at the man as if he were perhaps retarded, and responded with a non-answer. "Even if I did shack up with Yumi, Why exactly would I admit to it? That is quite literally an admission of guilt to a crime that carries a death penalty. Do you really think I would be stupid enough to brag about that openly if I had committed such a serious offense? Carl immediately feigned offense over the fact that his friend did not trust him with such a dangerous secret, while Dolph broke out into a wide smile before asking Eric an obvious question. Oh, so her name is Yumi? You two must have gotten to know each other pretty well if she permitted you to use her given name. After all, I heard the Ana usually refer to one another by their surnames, unless they are particularly close. You might as well admit it, bro. You lost your V-card to a beautiful older Ana woman, you lucky bastard. If I weren't your friend, I'd want to strangle you right now. Eric chose not to respond to this, and instead grabbed one of his chicken nuggets and dunked it into his fry sauce before eating the thing whole. The sudden silence which he had chosen to engage in only further cemented the idea in his friends' minds that he had indeed slept with Yumi. Not that any of them cared. If anything, they were actually quite jealous because as mutants, they were destined to die as virgins. Yet Eric had seemingly escaped this cruel fate. Despite the envy that his friends portrayed, Eric was more concerned with this bitch of an idol who seemed to have an issue with him for a reason he could not identify. If it was only a matter of discriminating against mutants, then she would not have gone this far to do so. Clearly, the fact that he was a mutant and doing well for himself was deeply personal to Erica. He just could not understand why this was the case no matter how much he thought about it. There were plenty of mutants who lived acceptable lives across the Empire, so why was this little bitch so fixated on making his life miserable? Honestly, Eric could live for 1,000,000 years and never come close to understanding the mind of a woman. It was simply an enigma that had eluded men since the dawn of their species. But there was nothing he could do about the targeted harassment that he was receiving from one of the Empire's most popular rising talents, and thus, he could only do what he had always done since the day he was born. Lament his lot in life and endure the abuse that came his way. The best thing he could do now was to keep moving forward, and make something of himself despite everyone who had ever spit on him for the color of his hair and eyes. And that was how he chose to live his life. Chapter 14, Disowned. It took nearly the rest of the semester for life to go back to normal for Eric. And the only reason this had happened was because the government of the Germanic Star Empire had come out and made a public statement saying that they had investigated the claims regarding Eric's alleged act of racial disgrace, and found that he had in reality committed no wrongdoing. This was shocking to Eric, because he had 100% slept with Yumi the night he first moved to Germania to attend a naval academy. And if the government truly investigated the matter, it would be easy for them to convict him. Clearly, there was someone in a position of power looking after Eric, and he knew for a fact that it was not his father. There were only a handful of people in the Empire who could bury his crimes, and each of them was a terrifying presence that he did not want to associate with. Little did Eric know that his little stunt in the simulator had caught the attention of the Grand Admiral himself, who was willing to overlook a simple act of youthful indiscretion when it was committed by such a promising young talent. When the semester ended, and Eric received his grades, he was pleasantly surprised that he had maintained his flawless marks in all subjects. Though, in order to accomplish this, he was forced to work harder than he had ever done so in his life. As a result of his efforts, Eric was now at the rank of a cadet captain, and stood proudly at number 13 on the leaderboard. Eric was officially halfway through his years at the Naval Academy, and by the time fall began next year, he would graduate before entering the most elite school the Empire had at its disposal. That was assuming he managed to maintain his current position on the leaderboard, or even improved it. After saying a particularly light-hearted farewell to his friends, Eric boarded a starship, which would take him back to his homeworld of Alemania, where he would spend the holidays with his family, who he had not seen for almost an entire year. However, this time he did not have a chance encounter with a foreign beauty. Instead, Eric sat next to a group of Germanic citizens who immediately recognized him for being the mutant who had caused such controversy over these last few months. Despite their taunts, Eric did not respond to his fellow passengers, and instead thought deeply about how this past year at the academy had gone for him. He had met several friends, who he could already tell would be amongst his social circle until the day he finally died. As unreliable as Dolph, Carl, and Frederick could be, they were still a good group of guys and were unlikely to suffer a permanent death during their military careers. Something which could not be said for Eric, whose supremely dangerous role in the Navy would put him at such a risk quite often. Especially if he was forced to fight beyond the range of the Empire's interstellar network. After a particularly grueling journey back to Alemania, Eric accessed the first taxi available, which drove him back to his parents' home. Where immediately upon entering the building, he was glomped by his mother, who was beyond happy to see that her son was doing so well for himself. "Eric, you are finally home at last. I missed you so much. Did you miss Mommy as well?" Eric had never seen his mother behave this way before, and he got the feeling that she was deeply worried about the attention he had gathered on the grid, especially after Eric had reposted the photo he took with Yumi in what seemed like a lifetime ago. However, he was quick to assure the woman that he was fine. After all, he was used to being harassed by the public, and all they could really do was say mean words to him over the grid, which had no effect whatsoever on his mental state. In all honesty, Eric could not fathom what kind of sensitive sissy would get so offended by such nonsense. "I'm fine, mother, and yes, before you start pouting, I missed you." "Why wouldn't I? You are practically the only person in this universe who actually cares about me." Krista had a warm smile on her face as she hugged her eldest son tightly in her arms. These were exactly the words she wanted to hear and was quick to voice her agreement with them. "And don't you forget it. Now come, I have prepared all your favorite meals while I waited for your arrival. I can only imagine what kind of cheap food they feed you all at the academy." His mother's words were a bit harsh. The reality was there was nothing wrong with the food served at the Naval Academy. It was mostly healthy and tasted great. Though nothing could beat his mother's home cooking, at least not so far as Eric was concerned, and thus he smiled as he followed the woman into the dining room, where he saw that his father was sitting at the head of the table, by himself with a rather stern expression on his face. Upon seeing that her husband clearly intended to speak with their son in private, Krista took the hint, and fled to the kitchen after leaving some parting words. "Oh, I just remembered the spitzel is still in the oven. I'll leave you two alone while I go fetch it." Though Eric did not want to speak with his father, he realized he had no choice but to do so, and thus quickly sat down at the table with a particularly loathsome expression on his otherwise handsome face as he spoke to his father in a rather informal manner. "Go ahead, get on with it. I doubt Mother is willing to wait forever for you to begin your little scolding." Henrik looked at his errant son as if he was looking at a criminal, and could only click his tongue for several minutes, as if to audibly display the disdain he felt for his son at this moment before finally speaking in a voice filled with hatred. "You have a lot of nerve, you know that? After everything I have done for you over the years, you repay me by fucking some alien slut on the day you were supposed to report to the academy. Do you have any idea of the trouble you have caused me? I can pretty much say goodbye to becoming an over-sector governor within the next century thanks to your actions. The only reason your atoms haven't already been scattered across the universe is because the woman you slept with was the aunt of the Ana Emperor. And she went out of her way to make sure you weren't punished for your actions. Which is more than I can say for most of the idiots she seduces. Normally, this would have been the end of things, but you just had to post a photo of the two of you together in a way that made it seem like the two of you were fucking. Do you have any idea the flack I got from my superiors because that image of you went viral? I can't believe they haven't executed you already. I do not know what kind of powerful friends you have made at the Naval Academy, but you better watch your back from now on, because the favor he showed you, by burying the evidence of your crime, is the kind of debt you do not want to have. You are, without a doubt, my greatest failure in life, and unfortunately, I have the ultimate displeasure of being your father. I want you to go back to the academy, and never show your face around here again. I will no longer allow you into my home after what you have done. You are an utter disgrace to our race and are no son of mine." Krista was secretly listening into the conversation, and was utterly flabbergasted by what she had heard. She knew that her son was rather fond of Ana women, something she had gone to great lengths to conceal from her husband. But she had never believed that her boy would be foolish enough to actually act on those wicked desires. Nor did she expect that her husband would go to such lengths to punish their son for his crimes against the Empire. The poor woman was in tears, knowing that this was perhaps the last time she would ever see her eldest son. And thus, she rushed forward out of the kitchen, and clutched a dumbstruck Eric into her breast. "Oh Eric, what have you done?" It took several moments for Eric to realize that he had just effectively been disowned by his parents, and no matter how much his mother loved him, she was honor-bound to obey her husband. Thus, she could only cry and hug her son while comforting him over the fact that he had just lost his family. No longer welcomed in his own home, Eric quickly picked up his bags and left the scene without even saying another word to his parents. He then climbed into the nearest taxi, and took the next flight back to Germania, where he would spend the rest of his winter vacation alone in his dorm room. For the entire duration of his flight, Eric stared into space, completely dumbfounded by the fact that his parents had disowned him. As much as he knew that his father had always despised him for being a mutant, he thought that the bond they shared as a family was strong enough to overcome that. Apparently, he had misjudged his father, who cared more about his political career, and his public image, than he did for his own son. If he was being honest with himself, losing his father and siblings was not something that Eric truly cared about, at least not after thinking about it for some time in silence. No, what tore his heart apart was the fact that he had just lost his mother, who was perhaps the only person in the universe who actually cared about him. Thus, after arriving at his dorm on Germania, and staring into space while taking a shower for what seemed to be a lifetime, Eric climbed into his bed and activated the grid. Honestly, he did not know what had come over him in the hour of his grief, but in his bewildered state he sent a direct message to someone who he had never spoken to before in his life, someone who hated his guts almost as much as his father. Erika had just gotten out of the bath and was dressed in nothing but a towel, which barely concealed her voluptuous figure. She had a pretty smile on her face as she dried her hair and applied her makeup. Never in a million years would she anticipate what was about to happen to her. A direct message appeared in Erika's social media while she was dressing up her hair in a ponytail, which she immediately noticed. Thinking that perhaps it was her manager, she quickly opened the chat to see that it was from someone she was all too familiar with, but had never spoken to in the past. I hope you are happy with yourself. I don't know what I have ever done to make you hate me with such zeal, but because of you, I have officially been disowned. You will never know what it is like to be in my position, nor do I think you are remotely capable of the most basic form of empathy. But allow me to explain to you my situation, in the vain hope that you might learn from your actions and become a better person in the future. Since the day I was born, there has only ever been one person who has showed me any kindness that was beyond superficial, and now, thanks to you, I will never speak with her again. I have no one, and within a year, I will enter military service, where I will be risking my life so that pampered little girls like you can continue to live your carefree lives. So by all means, enjoy your victory, for you have effectively ruined my life, and yet despite my many hours of soul searching, I can't think of what I have ever done to deserve this. Goodbye Erika, I hope we never meet in this life. Because I can't imagine what I would do to you if I ever saw you in person. Despite the fact that she had emerged victorious in her one-sided vendetta, Erika did not feel the slightest bit happy about this outcome. She had never once thought about the possible outcomes of her actions. After all, she was a teenage girl who was simply venting the frustrations she had with her condition by attacking someone similar to herself. It was never supposed to be anything serious. But now, after realizing the damage she had caused, the teenage idol felt as if there was a black hole in her chest, one which was constantly sucking the life out of her. She was just about to respond to Eric's message in an attempt to redeem herself when a knock resounded on her door. Erika. What are you doing in there? You have 5 minutes before it is showtime. Hurry up. Knowing that she had a concert to perform, the pink-haired beauty turned off her notifications, and finished getting dressed, before fulfilling her responsibilities as an up-and-coming idol. However, the guilt she felt in that moment had not vanished, and all she could do was mask the pain with a pretty smile and flirtatious gaze. Chapter 15, Making the Best of a Bad Situation. Eric went to sleep immediately after sending Erika the message, not because he was particularly tired, but because he was so sick of living that he just wanted his mind to fade to black for a few hours, so that he did not have to think about how everything had suddenly imploded on him. As for Erika, she performed on stage to the best of her ability, but everyone in the audience, and on the live stream, could tell that something was off about her. Whether it was the sound in her voice that appeared to be on the verge of cracking, or the expression on her face which made her look as if she was just barely managing to keep things together, everyone knew that something was going on with the young pop idol. And while the grid began to theorize about what had caused the teenage celebrity such distress, she concluded her act, and went straight back to her changing room, where she gazed upon the message that Eric had sent her in total silence for some time. Erika could not count the number of times she typed out a whole page worth of her thoughts, only to erase it time and again, fearing it was not a proper expression of her regret or her actions. In the end, after nearly 3 hours of trying to apologize in a way which was sincere and meaningful, she gave up on the idea and decided to simply cease her harassment of the man. This was the best decision that she could make after everything she had done. Eric awoke the next day sometime in the latter half of the morning. Though his mind was clear, and his body was more than capable of moving, he stayed perfectly still, as if completely lifeless for well over an hour. The thoughts that plagued his mind were myriad and troublesome. Losing his mother was perhaps the greatest blow ever dealt to his heart and mind. She was the only person who had ever really cared for him, and while he made some friends at the academy, they were not remotely close enough to be considered family at this point in time. He was truly alone in this universe, living in a society that hated him because of something he had no control over. Eric did not even bother accessing the grid, knowing that all which awaited him was harassment and death threats, something he could do without at this very moment. Instead, he dedicated the rest of his morning to thinking about his life, and what he wanted to accomplish. Until now, he had just been going through the motions. Doing what was expected of him, performing his duty to the empire like everyone else. But did he really feel any pride for the nation he was born into? It is not like the Germanic Star Empire cared the slightest whether he lived or died. No, he was a pawn for those in power to wield as they saw fit. The same could be said for everyone else, but at least his peers were rewarded for their struggles by the state. Every man was given a wife and encouraged to have a family. The state provided them with housing, food, water, medicine and every other resource that was required to live. And while Eric would earn himself a house after military service, it would be empty, with only himself filling up the space. Was this the life he really wanted to live? All alone, just as he was right now, for the next 250 years? And that was assuming he had an average lifespan. If he was particularly useful to the Empire, they had plenty of ways to extend his life, and by extension, his misery. This was what life had in store for him if he chose to remain in the Empire. However, defection was also not a viable option. Travel in and outside of the Germanic Star Empire was strictly monitored, and if it was believed that you posed a risk of defection, you would not be permitted to leave. Assuming he somehow did manage to escape from his home, what would he do then? How would he live? The galaxy was a vast and unforgiving place, especially if you were on your own, with nobody else to look after you. Civilizations survived the harshness of space because they were united together, usually by race, not by striking it out on your own. However, a man who had abandoned his species would be looked down upon by everyone, and there were few safe havens that existed in the greater galaxy for those who were exiled from their homelands. In fact, Eric had never even heard of one existing. Thus, defection was simply not a realistic option. His fate was tied to the Empire, because the only other place that might reasonably accept him was the Confederation of Human Worlds. However, would they even recognize him as a member of the same species? After all, the Germanic people considered themselves to be an entirely different species than baseline humans, and would never accept one in their society. Would the same not be true for those people whose evolution had diverged on a separate path centuries ago? Even if he did manage to be accepted by such a foreign and hostile society, their beliefs were simply too disgusting for Eric to tolerate. While he may have been discriminated against by Germanic society, he was by no means a liberal person, and despite the fact that the society which he lived in treated him poorly, Eric supported many of the things that his people believed, even if he was not as fanatical as the other members of his species. After several hours lost in thought, Eric was beginning to believe that he would never find happiness in the world, and that his best option was to simply toe the party line, and endure the abuse and harassment which came his way, just like he had always done. That is, until a specific memory suddenly flooded his mind, seemingly out of nowhere. It was the first day he had met his friends, when they were discussing the leaderboard, and the rewards one would get for climbing its ranks. At first, Eric had assumed what he heard had been just another tall tale. After all, there were many rumors, such as the one that Carl had told him, which proved to be false. Thus, he did not even bother to investigate the validity of the claim. However, at the moment, Eric latched onto the words his friend had spoken, as if it were his only lifeline. I heard from a rather reliable source about a Black Sun pilot who was a mutant like us, but because of his achievements on the battlefield, the party permitted him to have a wife and children. Remembering these words, Eric quickly surfed the grid for any mention of such an unlikely story, and quickly found that it was indeed true. A pilot of the elite fighter squadron known by the name Black Sun had achieved such shocking achievements in combat that the restrictions which applied to mutants were lifted from him. In fact, after decades of exemplary service, the man finally retired from the Navy at the age of 65, and immediately became a planetary governor. He had risen above the discrimination that mutants faced in Germanic society, and had even become a powerful member of the political party. However, there was no recent news on this individual, or what rank he currently held. Still, if this man could achieve such a thing, then why couldn't he? Currently, Eric was ranked 13th on the Academy's leaderboards, and that was without really developing the special abilities he had, or using them in any significant capacity which could affect his ranking. If he truly began giving it his all from here on out, he could reach first place by the time he graduated next year, guaranteeing him a spot in the Empire's most elite flight school, and an advantage over his peers when he finally entered military service. Thus, in that moment, Eric decided to not only stay within the borders of the Empire, but rise through its ranks, until one day everyone would have to kneel before him. Once he was the supreme leader, he could abolish the restrictions that mutants suffered through, and ensure that nobody like him ever had to endure what he had in life. Eric spent every waking hour during his vacation studying like a madman. When classes reconvened 2 weeks later, he had become a man possessed. Only through exceptional service to the state could he earn the right to have a family, something all of his peers had access to. Without a family of his own, there was no purpose to living in this universe. This was something which he felt in every atom of his being, and if he had to risk his life so that he could become a war hero, he would do it. Surprisingly, the harassment he received seemed to have died down, as Erica was no longer targeting him with every chance she could get. Whether she had given up because she had a change of heart after his message, or because she had already ruined his life and because of this, there was nothing further to be gained. Eric did not know the answer. What he did know is that he did not care either way, and thus he focused all of his effort on obtaining first place on the leaderboard. Whether it was PT in the morning, or all of his classes, Eric pushed himself beyond his natural limits, ensuring that he proved himself superior to the rest of his peers. It was not just his teachers and comrades who took notice of this sudden shift in behavior. In another part of the Empire's capital, a man sat in his office. It was a rather large office, with an excellent view of the city below. The red, black, and white banners of the Empire hung from the ceiling, showing off a display of both utilitarian and authoritarian ideology. This man was none other than the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy. His name was Alarico Emrys, a man born from Swiss ancestry, and who had climbed through the ranks of the Imperial Navy to the highest position after decades of exemplary service. Why was he named Alaric, instead of something more contemporary? Because during the decade he was born, there was a societal trend to revive ancient Germanic names, as a symbol of the unity that existed between the various Germanic peoples who inhabited the empire. Ultimately, this trend did not last long, and by the time the next generation was born, they went back to more modern naming conventions. After learning that Heinrich had disowned his son, Alaric was quite furious. Eric was a talent that was rare in the Empire, and the boy had already proven to be quite innovative in his thinking. If the Empire was going to survive the hardships of the galaxy, it needed to invest in young men like Eric, even if they happened to be so-called mutants. This was the reason that he had gone to such great lengths to bury the evidence of Eric's little dalliance with the aunt of the Ana Emperor. The fact that all the hard work Alaric had gone through in his efforts to conceal this crime from the public was repaid with such foolishness on the part of Eric's father was enough to make the Grand Admiral frustrated beyond belief. At first, Alaric thought that Eric would be broken by being disowned. And yet, the most peculiar thing happened. The young man had doubled his performance. Eric had become a madman in pursuit of his military training and academic studies, spending even his lunch hour either studying or engaging in simulations. If it weren't for the curfew that was imposed upon all cadets, then Eric might even spend his entire nights in the holodeck. This had only increased Alaric's opinion of Eric. He had become a man who had lost everything, a man who was scorned by society. And yet, he had not given up on life, nor had he chosen to abandon the Empire, which showed him nothing but hostility, but instead had decided to double down and work even harder to make something of himself. How many men in Eric's position could do the same? The fierce determination that Eric displayed after being disowned was something that even the most prejudiced man should respect, and because of this, the Grand Admiral decided to watch Eric's future career with a close eye. Unknowingly, Eric had gained a very powerful backer, one who would do his best to direct the promising young talent's career, so that he could best make use of his abilities for the good of the Empire. Chapter 16, The Starfighter Tournament. At the start of spring, during Eric's second year at the Naval Academy, something interesting happened. By now, Eric was ranked number 10th on the leaderboard, and most of the students were making bets as to whether or not he would graduate the top of his class. Though, despite his best efforts, Eric was having a difficult time getting past 10th place, and just when he had begun to feel as if he had no hope of climbing to his desired position in what little time remained before he graduated, a sudden announcement was made by the headmaster via the Academy's internal network. On May 22, 2500, we will be hosting a virtual reality starfighter tournament between all the naval academies within the Empire. For those cadets who have been selected for service within the Starfighter Corps, you are encouraged to participate in this tournament. The champion will be awarded with 1 million points, and 250,000 credits. The sudden announcement of a starfighter tournament was almost too good to be true. Just when Eric thought that he would not be able to graduate at the top of his class, the heavens had given him a golden opportunity to do so. With the first place prize of 1 million points, Eric would jump straight into the top 3 ranking of all naval cadets in the Empire. From there, it was a stone's throw away to the number 1 position. And while the points immediately drew Eric's eye, he had to admit the 250,000 credit prize was also an enormous help to a man without a family. Credits were the primary currency used by the Empire for all transactions. Until now, the only income Eric had was through his monthly stipend, which he used primarily to feed himself. However, 250,000 credits were quite the vast sum, and would allow him to live comfortably for several years. Thus, this was a grand opportunity, one which he did not plan to miss out on. With this in mind, Eric immediately signed up for the Starfighter tournament, which would be held in virtual reality in the coming months. As for how he would prepare for this event, there was no greater test than accessing the Interstellar Virtual Reality Network, where he would compete against other players in dogfights. Though if Eric did this, he would not just be fighting against fellow cadets, but also veteran pilots and hobbyists, giving him a wide sample pool of talent to train himself against. And while Eric was passionate about this God-given opportunity, he had no idea that it was all organized by the Grand Admiral as a way to assist his favorite cadet in gaining the highly coveted position as the top graduate of his class. Before Eric knew it, May 22 had arrived, and thus, He spent the day in his room, attached to the virtual reality network. As he entered the Academy's lobby system for the tournament, a wide variety of competitors not just from his own naval academy, but the 99 other facilities which existed across the Germanic Star Empire immediately greeted him. The looks on everyone's faces were the same as the expression that he himself wore: excitement. Adrenaline and endorphins pumped through Eric's blood, as he waited for the free-for-all dogfights which would determine the first bracket of competitors. Each pilot would be paired up with a certain number of his rivals, and whoever was the last man standing would advance into the next bracket of the tournament. Billions of cadets were competing in this event, but because an infinite number of bouts were capable of being completed at the same time, they were effectively able to host the tournament in the span of a single day. The rules were simple: a cadet was only permitted to use a dagger, which was the primary starfighter of the Empire. He could use any special abilities he might have inherited, either from his parents or the genetic serum, and could use any other means at his disposal to win the battle royale. There were virtually no limits on what could be done to achieve victory. Thus Eric had an enormous advantage over his rivals due to his ability to control machines with his thoughts, and his ability to see 7 seconds into the future. However, in a battle royale that consisted of thousands of hostile starfighters, anything could happen, especially since he was not the only one with a few tricks up his sleeve. Immediately after entering the virtual reality world, Eric found himself in the middle of a dagger's cockpit, within an asteroid belt. The environment of each match was procedurally generated, and, if one was truly unlucky, they would have to compete near a black hole, or even a star that was about to go supernova. Because anything could happen in the vast emptiness of space, the simulator took these many probable scenarios and added them into the matches. While Eric had begun to set his engines to maximum speed, he noticed a countdown on his heads-up display, more commonly known as HUD, which signaled how long it would be until the match started. As the countdown got closer to 0, Eric felt his heart palpitate. This was it. Now was the time to sink or swim. And he did not intend to drown by any means. Thus, he kept his head on a swivel as the counter reached 0, before initiating his afterburners, which sent him barreling through the asteroid field as he searched for his nearest target. Navigating through an asteroid field at sublight speeds, with the possibility of an enemy lurking around every corner, was by no means a relaxing environment. In fact, Eric was sweating profusely, which was transmitted into the virtual world. After nearly 5 minutes of avoiding space debris, Eric's radar picked up a signature for a split second before it disappeared. Realizing that something wasn't right, Eric activated his special ability, which he referred to as foresight. Not only did he see 7 seconds into the future, but he also saw the multiple potential realities that were likely to occur during this time. For most of his life, Eric had neglected this ability, but after being disowned by his parents, and determining that the only way he would be able to obtain happiness through life was through relentless effort, he had begun training his abilities like a madman, and now he could quite easily decipher which outcome was the most likely to occur. Thus, in a microsecond, he had determined that the nearest enemy was hiding on the other side of an asteroid which was nearly 500 kilometers away, and had turned off his engines to avoid detection. The moment Eric passed by the asteroid, he would be gunned down by the man who was lying in wait for him. Realizing that this was the most likely possible outcome of the multiple visions he had seen, Eric locked onto the asteroid which the enemy was hiding behind with his targeting array, and launched an antimatter missile at it. Without even realizing his trap had been seen through, the enemy pilot was blown to smithereens, along with the asteroid that his starfighter sat upon. Immediately Eric was awarded with 500 points, which went to his ranking on the leaderboard. Excited that he had the potential to earn far more than 1 million credits overall from this tournament, Eric began adeptly navigating through the asteroid field, with his mind, rather than the joystick, as if his starfighter was just an extension of his body. The movements he made were completely unnatural, and had thrown off many of his pursuers. In fact, after being chased for well over 10,000 kilometers by an enemy, Eric suddenly reversed his engines with his mind to counter the force in which he was traveling through space, which allowed his craft to come to an abrupt and sudden stop. In the second that he did this, the pilot who was pursuing him shot right past his target, allowing Eric to lock onto him with a missile and blow him up. It was not just the students of the academy who watched the virtual reality tournament unfold. In fact, it was broadcasted across the Interstellar network, allowing everyone to witness this newest generation of starfighter pilots to display their abilities. And while there were quite literally millions if not billions of instances to choose from, the one which Eric was competing in drew the attention of many people, particularly because of the bizarre way which he managed to pilot his craft. Everyone immediately began to flood the comments of the livestream with remarks about Eric being a cheater, until one person in particular defended him, someone which nobody in the Empire thought would ever come to the mutant's defense. Eric Krieger typed a comment on the livestream which surprised everyone, one which thoroughly disproved the cheating narrative. He is not cheating. I looked into this man's background after he knocked out that cadet nearly a year ago and went viral. Eric Yeager has two special abilities, telepathy, and cyberkinesis. In other words, he is effectively able to communicate with his competitors, and manipulate his starfighter in ways it was not designed to perform with nothing but his mind. No doubt, while he is controlling his starfighter, he is also disrupting his opponent's focus with a tidal wave of mental harassment. It is no wonder why he is able to so effortlessly shoot down his peers. It was exactly as Eric had hypothesized. While Eric was manipulating his starfighter with his mind, he was also mentally harassing his opponents with an unprecedented degree of vulgarity. Something which would get on the nerves and disrupt the focus of most beings in the universe. While taunting an opponent with a particularly vile comment about the man's female relatives, Eric shot across his bow with his plasma cannon, which had dealt the final blow to his target's shields. He immediately followed up with an attack from his 3 laser repeaters, which shredded through the armor of the starfighter, and effortlessly blew it up. After all, the plasma cannon had a limited number of shots that could be fired with each cell, and thus he had to conserve the more powerful weapon for the rest of his opponents. However, Eric had no time to celebrate this victory, because the moment he shot down the other pilot, someone launched a missile at him. Just before the antimatter missile collided with Eric's starfighter, he deployed his countermeasures, which drew the missile away. Realizing that he had narrowly escaped defeat, Eric in a bout of anger targeted the opponent with his mind, and told him something so unspeakable, that it had thrown off his focus, where Eric then lit him up with his laser repeaters, thus blowing the starfighter out of the sky. With this, Eric had scored his 1000th kill, and had become the last man standing, thus advancing on to the next round of the tournament. The world watched with awe as Eric expertly defeated his opponents while suffering minimal damage. The grid was flooded with angry comments about how overpowered Eric's cyberkinesis was, but nobody except for the top brass of the Germanic government knew that he actually had a tertiary ability, one that had saved his hide in that match more times than he could count. As for Grand Admiral Alarico Emrys, he smiled and nodded his head in approval at Eric's performance, while watching the live stream with his beautiful young wife sitting in his lap. Alaric shouted in joy as he cheered for Eric's victory. "Well done, kid. Well done. I knew you had it in you." And while the Grand Admiral was excited about the skills Eric had displayed as a starfighter pilot, someone else was just as thrilled as he was while watching the live stream. Erica did not realize it, but at that moment, she was the happiest she had been since she ruined Eric's life several months ago. She did not say a word as she watched the match come to an end. Instead, she simply smiled while eagerly waiting to see the man she once harassed to the point of hopelessness, climb to the top of the rankings, and perhaps even win the tournament altogether. Chapter 17, No Surrender. Immediately after emerging victorious in the first round of the Starfighter tournament, Eric was sent into the next one. Like before, the surrounding space was procedurally generated and, because of this, there was no way to truly know just what environment he would be fighting in ahead of time. Unlike the first round, which eliminated over 90% of the contestants, those who survived their battle royale and entered the second round were among the most elite starfighter cadets in the Empire, or were extremely lucky. Either way, Eric could guess that every single one of his opponents would have at least one special ability that was ideal for being a pilot. Because of this, he could not relax, and instead kept his head on a swivel, as he piloted his starfighter through a dense nebula. While Eric skillfully maneuvered his way through the nebula, his actions were being watched by trillions of people across the Empire. Each of which wanting to see what this mutant, who had already caused several controversies, was capable of. However, this time he was not the hunter, instead an opponent had caught his scent, and had begun to stalk Eric through the nebula. It was only after a shot from the enemy's laser repeaters hit his rear shield, did Eric notice that he was under attack. Via the use of his cyberkinesis, Eric rapidly turned his starfighter around in the middle of a dense nebula and began to dart straight towards his opponent, while unleashing both his laser repeaters, along with his plasma cannon in a head-on dogfight. And while 100% of Eric's shots landed on his target, particularly because of his special abilities, the opponent missed more than a few of his own. Thus, as Eric's dagger swept past his rivals, he survived, while the enemy was blown up. Not only had the viewers across the Empire witnessed this daring dogfight, but several of his other opponents did as well, and perhaps in the first time since the tournament had begun, 3 starfighters jointly attacked a single target from separate directions. The shots of both plasma cannons and laser repeaters riddled Eric's shields, quickly reducing their integrity. If Eric did not think of a way to quickly turn the tables, he would not survive this encounter. Thus, it took him all of 3 seconds to calculate the percentage of his 3 opponents' accuracy, based upon the data his shields were reporting. In an act of desperation, he used his cyberkinesis to lower the shields on his left side, which was the area of his ship that was the least likely to sustain serious damage, based upon the enemy's pilot's rate of accuracy, and instead transferred the energy to his rear and right shields, which were bolstered momentarily. While he did this, Eric used his foresight ability to determine the most likely outcome of victory, and after spending no more than a microsecond in the prophetic state, he found there was only one path to survival. Thus, he killed his engine, pretending to have been damaged from the relentless onslaught of his opponents, and allowed them to dart towards him in an attempt to seize victory. Just when the three starfighters were about to pass by Eric's starfighter, he dumped some core fuel into his surroundings while maintaining control over it via the extension of his reactor's magnetic fields. From there, he fired a single shot of his plasma cannon into the expelled fuel and shunted all his remaining shield reserves to the front of his ship, anticipating a truly spectacular firework display. The Empire watched in awe at Eric's performance. If not for his ability to control machines with his mind, the maneuver he had just made would have easily cost him his life or, since this was a simulation, his place in the tournament. And yet, the special ability he had continued to stun the audience. While some people, like Grand Admiral Alarico Emrys, and the rising pop sensation Eric Krieger, gazed upon the performance as if it were the most brilliant thing they had ever witnessed. Others were quick to condemn Eric for his actions. Obviously, they were extremely envious of his abilities, and jealousy brought out the worst in people. Eric had no time to worry about what the live stream of the tournament thought of him, because almost immediately after eliminating the three pursuing starfighters, he was set upon by another opponent. After taking several heavy hits from the enemy's plasma cannon, which his shields managed to take, though not without reducing their strength in some areas for a short time, Eric skillfully manipulated his starfighter so that he could get behind the pursuing spacecraft, where he then proceeded to fire an antimatter missile at the bastard. Despite the enemy deploying his countermeasures, the missile was not deterred, specifically because Eric had used his cyberkinesis on it, allowing it to maintain its focus on the enemy starfighter rather than the diversion that was supposed to disrupt its path. The antimatter missile collided with the hull of the hostile starship, and blasted it to smithereens. For the rest of the round, Eric would continue to outperform his peers, until yet again, he managed to pull off an exemplary victory, to which the comments of the tournament's livestream were flooded with a mixture of praise and condemnation. Luckily for Eric, the contestants were given a 1-hour lunch break, to eat, drink, and take care of whatever bodily needs were necessary before the semi-finals began. While Eric was fighting for his chance to prove himself the best starfighter cadet in the Empire, the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy was filling out a form that would have a direct impact on Eric's life. Judging by the skills he displayed in the tournament, Eric was already capable enough to join a Special Forces squadron of his choosing. Despite this, Eric's knowledge was all based on simulations. He had no practical experience in the field, thus he would still need to attend flight school, but Grand Admiral Alarico Emrys believed that the young cadet was more than capable of passing with flying colors, and in a fraction of the time it would normally take to do so. Even if Eric did not win this tournament, he had displayed a level of capability with a starfighter that few pilots possessed. It was no wonder the Eye had selected the youth for service in the Starfighter Corps, despite the fact that his talents could be proven useful in any number of fields. Thus, Grand Admiral Alarico Emrys was in the act of signing a form, which would seal Eric's fate. Once his signature was signed at the bottom, he looked upon the form, before dialing a number on the Interstellar Network, which contacted the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire. All the while, the footage of Eric's feats in the tournament was being broadcasted in the background. The line connected to reveal the weary face of Hanzep. The man looked like he had aged 30 years since Eric first entered the academy, and he was clearly in a foul mood, as he snapped at his subordinate for calling him out of the blue. "What is it? I am incredibly busy right now. So make it quick." Alaric was quite surprised at the vitriolic reaction he had just received from a man who he considered to be a close friend, and thus, he knew immediately that something serious had occurred in the greater galaxy. As if he had forgotten his reason for calling, a grave expression formed on Alaric's face as he asked the immediate question on his mind. "What's wrong?" Supreme Leader Hanzep, who was about halfway through a 2-liter bottle of 200 proof whiskey, wiped the amber liquid from the corners of his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket before responding with a grim look in his haggard blue eyes. Nothing could have prepared Alaric for the words he would speak. The Alphaim Dominion's 5th Fleet was destroyed in combat against the Hive Fleet terminus and, as it stands, the Naraku are on an exact trajectory for our borders. I reckon it will take them 3 years, at the most, to get through all the civilizations that stand between us and them, and then... Well, you know what will happen then. Alaric could immediately understand how the Supreme Leader felt in this moment, and thus he was no longer in the mood to boast about the talents of a promising young cadet, who had a bright future ahead of him. Instead, he felt as if he was a man who had just been told he had 3 years to live. Thus, after swallowing the cold air which surrounded him, the Grand Admiral was quick to ask the first question that came to mind. "What about the Light Elves? How are they responding to this?" Surely they will be sending another fleet to deal with this problem. If they stand by and do nothing, half of their quadrant will be devoured before long. For perhaps the first time since Alaric had met the Supreme Leader, he saw the man openly badmouth the Alphaim Empress, as he spat on the ground and cursed her out with a hint of fury in his ocean blue eyes. The old bitch says that she has more pressing concerns. As a result of the Fifth Fleet's destruction, the Dark Elves have begun amassing their military on the border. She believes it will be an all-out war soon enough, and as a result, she cannot spare the men to deal with the Hive Fleet, even if it is rampaging in her quadrant. This was not the most welcome news in the world. In fact, Alaric felt in this moment that he had been dealt a mortal wound as he slid back into his chair, and stared in silence for several moments. After significant effort on his part, he managed to ask a question, one which he already knew the answer to. Then we are on our own? No matter how much he hoped that the Supreme Leader would have some good news for him, it was not destined to come to pass. Instead, Hans took a swig from his bottle and continued to drink until the entire thing was empty, where he immediately nodded his head while responding to the Grand Admiral's question. It would appear that we are. Considering that the Supreme Leader was already drinking his sorrows away, as if the Empire was already defeated, Alaric decided to do the same, as he broke out a bottle of whiskey, and begun to chug it as if his life depended on it. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, Supreme Leader Hanzap began to speak up once more, however his expression was utterly lifeless, as if he had lost all reason to live. I suppose we should begin evacuating our society's most elite citizens. Perhaps we can seek asylum on Alphaim. Trillions will die, but at least the foundation of our civilization will live on to rebuild. However, Alaric was not of the same opinion. Instead, he looked utterly offended by the Supreme Leader's cowardice. He immediately stood up and threw the bottle he held across the room, which flew through the holographic projection of his boss, and shattered against the wall. He was quick to reprimand the most powerful man in the Empire before defying what was clearly not a suggestion, even if it may have sounded like one. Absolutely not. If you wish to evacuate the members of the party, then you are free to do so, but you will not be using any of my naval vessels. We are the Germanic people. Whether it was on Earth or here in the greater galaxy, we have never once backed down in the face of defeat, and we will not do so now. You spineless politicians have forgotten the blood which runs through your veins. We are warriors. There is no enemy in this universe that we fear. So, go ahead. Flee for all I care. But the men of Germania will stand their ground, and if we are to go extinct, then we will have such an end that history will remember our struggle until the end of time itself. I will muster the fleet, where I will spend these next 3 years preparing for the arrival of Naraku, and when the enemy enters our borders, we will teach those mindless bugs what it means to be afraid. We will bathe in the blood of our enemies and teach the galaxy a lesson of what it means to have our great race as an enemy. Or we will die trying. There is no other option. After saying this, Alaric hung up on the Supreme Leader, and immediately contacted the High General of the Imperial Army, and informed the man about the grave news which he had just received, as well as the Supreme Leader's opinion on the matter. Much like Alaric, the High General was furious that the Supreme Leader would turn his back on the Empire, and had chosen to die in Germanic space, rather than flee like a coward. Thus, while the entire Empire was watching Eric's performance in the tournaments, the Admiralty began sending out tens of billions of recall orders, reassignments, construction orders, and summons, all just the beginning of what would soon be the largest military campaign of all time. But a seemingly unwinnable challenge is exactly what the German people craved, and they would face it head-on. Chapter 18, Winning the Tournament. While Eric was competing in the semi-finals of the Germanic Star Empire's Cadet Starfighter Tournament, Empress Lunaria Asterion sat upon her throne on the world of Alphaim with a cold expression on her otherwise beautiful face. She was in all honesty surprised at the outcome of the battle between her Fifth Fleet and the Naraku Hive Fleet terminus. So much so that she had cancelled all of her plans for the day, and called forth her council of sages, who had rushed forth to meet with their empress. The room was filled with ancient-looking elves, who were so old that their age was visibly displayed on their faces. These primeval members of the species were dressed in emerald green robes, with golden embroidery. For millions of years, these men and women had advised the Asterian dynasty, and now they were once more summoned to do so. With a particularly snarky look on her face, Lunaria called out to the sages, while her youngest daughter, Celestia, stood by her side, with an expression that appeared as if being able to attend this meeting was the greatest honor of her relatively young life. So, it appears that the vision you old fogies spoke of all those years ago has indeed become a reality. The Fifth Fleet has been destroyed, utterly decimated by the Naraku Hive Fleet terminus. And, as it stands, those disgusting fucking bugs are headed towards the home of my favorite pups. Realistically speaking, such a young upstart of an interstellar civilization does not have any chance of survival against the Naraku. After all, The Germanic Star Empire's entire navy cannot contend with one of our fleets, and yet the Naraku tore the fifth fleet to pieces. So tell me, because I desperately want to know, how will they survive against such monstrous beasts if we do not come to their rescue? The head of the Council of Sages stepped forward and bowed before his empress. Despite the respect he showed her, he still thought of the woman as a mere child. After all, she was not even 1,000,000 years old, when compared to a man like himself, who was beyond what many would consider being ancient. She truly was nothing more than a little girl in his eyes. The fact that she had the gall to ask him to explain himself regarding what he had personally seen was among the greatest insults he could receive. If Lunaria's mother was still the empress, then perhaps he would explain in great detail what his vision entailed, but this little girl had no respect for the sages, and thus, he would not deign her with a proper response. You do not need to know the specifics, but we have seen the fate which awaits the Hive Fleet terminus, and by the time of your precious Centennial War Games, they will be exterminated. The concern you have for your subjects, or puppies as you like to refer to them as, is unfounded. So, do not worry about the Naraku, for they are not long for this world. At least not the Hive Fleet known as Terminus. Instead, you should focus your attention on the Svartalfheim Federation, who has perceived the loss of the Rylonian Imperium to be a great weakness on our part, and have thus begun to bare their fangs in response. If we do not respond with strength at the borders, then the Dark Elves will invade our lands and start a war, which will cause the stars to be drenched in blood. I suggest contacting a trade prince from the Gimdari Trade Union, and requesting that they interfere in this dispute, before our rivals realize that we have lost a fleet. Lunaria narrowed her gaze at the head of her council of sages and scoffed before insulting him further. Acronius, is this the wisdom that you have derived from yet another one of your visions? The way that the Elven Empress had said the word visions clearly displayed her disbelief in what she perceived to be nothing more than old superstitions, which a bunch of conmen had used to claim power in a bygone era. However, Celestia was not of the same opinion as her mother. She took the sage's visions as more fact than fiction, and thus eagerly awaited for the head of the Council of Sages, whose name was Acronius, to respond to her mother's skepticism. Which he quickly did shortly thereafter, with a smug smile on his aging face. No, my empress. This is the wisdom derived from observation and logic. If you mobilize even more fleets to deal with the Hive Fleet terminus, who, as I already said, are not long for this world, then you will be giving our enemies a chance to invade our borders and annex critical territory. Even if the Gimdari Trade Union interferes after the Dark Elves invade, those bastards will not give up the land they have seized. Thus, after all of my years of experience advising the empresses before you, I believe that it would be most prudent to prevent such a scenario from happening while we still have the opportunity to do so. Do you not agree? Though Lunaria despised being told off by this old charlatan, she had to agree that his reasoning was solid. That was, of course, if his vision turned out to be correct, and the Naraku Hive Fleet was dealt a fatal blow in ways she could not even imagine. Assuming this was the truth, then indeed, the most prudent option would be to mobilize her forces at the border. Of course, she had already decided on this course of action long before Acronius had suggested it, and had even informed the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire of her decision hours before. Why? Because subconsciously she believed that the visions of the sages were real, even if she did not want to admit it because of her agenda. This was why Lunaria put so much emphasis on the Germanic Star Empire, because the sages had determined they would be a valuable weapon to make use of on the galactic stage, even if it took them millennia to prove themselves as such. Thus, she had decided to invest in the Germanic race as far back as 300 years ago, when she first encountered them. Even if she told herself it was because she found them to be more attractive than her own kind. Still, Lunaria could not help but worry about the fate of the Germanic people, and thus she could only sigh and shake her head while Acronius drawled on about the threat that the Dark Elves currently posed to her borders. As previously mentioned, she had already decided on sending her fleets to the borders, and thus, after a particularly masterful act of disappointment, she agreed to Acronius' suggestion. Very well. I have no choice but to send our troops to the border. The Germanic Star Empire will have to fend for themselves. But if you happen to be wrong, and my precious puppies are exterminated, Acronius, then I will come for your head. The man simply smiled and nodded his head, utterly confident that the vision he had seen would come to pass, and thus he bowed once more in front of the Empress before departing from the room, but not before leaving one final statement behind. Of course, I expect no less from your majesty. Eric was screaming with excitement as he scored the last kill in the semi-finals. This was it. One more match, and he would be declared champion. In addition to the 1 million points he would receive for winning the tournament, he had already gained nearly 750,000 points through the many kills he had racked up throughout the various rounds of the competition. Which meant that he should easily be ranked the top of the Academy's leaderboard if he won this tournament. Not to mention the 250,000 credit prize pool, which was enough to either buy him a large villain on a frontier world, or a small starship. All that was left was a 1v1 with the other best pilot in the cadre of cadets that existed across the Empire. Thus, as the countdown made its way to 0 and the match began, Eric felt as if he was on the top of the world. Upon entering the combat zone, Eric realized that he was in yet another asteroid field, which he maneuvered through with exceptional skill. Not only had he pushed the engines to the maximum, but he had even used his cyberkinesis to add an extra 20% to his top speed, allowing him to transcend the limits which the fighter was designed to achieve, though it did put some stress on the engines and hull of the starfighter. Before long, a blip appeared on his sensors, and Eric knew the final showdown was about to begin. He quickly pursued the enemy pilot, who appeared to wield his starfighter almost as if it were an extension of his body. This bewildered not only Eric, but the entire audience who was watching the live stream. It was clear both of these men had cyberkinesis, and thus would be an even match. Or so everyone thought. However, Eric was not a single enhanced German, nor was he a double enhanced German. No, he was an extremely rare triple enhanced German, meaning he had 3 abilities, and thus he began to harass the other pilot with his mind, as he cursed him out. "Hey, asshole, just so you know, after I've defeated you in this tournament, I'm going to find your mother and your sisters and fuck them all in front of you. Once all of your female relatives are pregnant with my children, I will force you to father them in my place." Clearly this remark had gotten on his opponent's nerves, who began to fire upon Eric as the two played a game of chicken with one another. However, Eric had other plans, and quickly maneuvered his starfighter around in a way which avoided the shots, while firing his own laser repeaters at the enemy. The two men had both missed one another, as they appeared equal in skill, causing Eric to continue to speak violent grotesque words towards his opponent in an attempt to throw him off his game. However, the rival pilot turned out to be a double-enhanced human, and responded to Eric's insults by hurling asteroids with him via his telekinesis. These asteroids were large enough to turn Eric's starfighter into a heap of scrap metal, and thus Eric quickly found himself at a disadvantage as he was forced to dodge both the weapon on board the enemy's starfighter, and the dangerous environment. Quickly finding himself on the defensive, Eric was forced to use his third and final ability, as he gazed 7 seconds into the future in search of an opening. Which he found, but if he was off by just a millisecond, it would mean that he would be the one to suffer a defeat. With a heavy sigh, Eric pushed his joystick forward and boosted his speed to the maximum setting while flying straight at the enemy pilot. At first, the guy thought Eric was playing another game of chicken, and thus, he chuckled as he continued to fire his shots at Eric while also throwing more asteroids at him. 5 seconds had gone by, and Eric showed no sign of breaking off, and yet, the hostile pilot did not dare break off, and instead continued to pilot his ship directly at the mutant who dared to insult his family. Finally, just before the two ships were about to crash into one another, Eric pulled the eject feature on his seat, and shot himself into space, while his starfighter collided directly into the hostile pilot, killing him instantly, and ending the virtual reality tournament once and for all in Eric's favor. The entirety of the Germanic Star Empire, or at least the trillions of citizens who had watched the live stream, gazed in astonishment at what Eric had done. Seeing that he had no chance to overcome the enemy's combined attacks, Eric had sacrificed his ship to earn a kill. It was entirely unthinkable for most pilots. Considering once you ejected, you would be stranded in space until someone picked you up, and if your flight suit was damaged in the process, you could face certain death. But because it was a simulation, this was not a factor, and thus, Eric had achieved a victory, thus earning himself the 1 million points, and the 250,000 credits. Out of everyone who was watching the broadcast, perhaps nobody had a wider smile on their face than the up-and-coming idol Erica Krieger, who shouted out in joy after seeing the man she had previously harassed to the point of hopelessness win the tournament. Chapter 19, Graduating from the Academy. Since winning the tournament, all eyes had begun to pry into Eric's daily life. Especially on campus, where fellow cadets would watch as the silver-haired young man did everything in his power to increase the divide between himself and the other high-ranking students. He, like everyone else in the Empire, was blissfully unaware of the threat which the Germanic Star Empire would soon be facing. At the moment, Supreme Leader Hanzap was currently engaging in a conversation with the Alphaim Empress, who had taken time out of her busy schedule to accept his call. The look on her beautiful face was one of concern, as the man voiced the two diverging viewpoints that the political party and the military now had on how they should deal with the Naraka threat, which was rapidly approaching their borders. It is my intention to escape from this sinking ship while I still can with those of our empire who are most capable of restoring civilization once the Naraka Hive fleet has been dealt with. I intend to take the most elite of my people's society and have them evacuate to our embassy on your home world. However, it would appear that both the Grand Admiral and the High General have other plans. They intend to stand and fight until the last man. They have no intentions of fleeing. Instead, They are now drawing upon every resource to expand our military prowess and bolster the lines of defense against Terminus. It is because of this that they are not even willing to provide our party members with an armed escort to Alfheim. Thus, I am afraid that I must request that you personally see to it that the greatest members of our race are ferried off to your homeworld, where we will be able to survive the coming catastrophe, and rebuild from amongst the ashes. Lunaria gazed at Hans with a peculiar look on her face. Hans had always been a practical man. If all hope was lost, then he would flee and return to fight another day. Normally this was a personality trait that the Light Elven Empress would admire in her vassals. However, the sole purpose she had for fostering the Germanic Star Empire was because of their use as a weapon of war. If they were not going to even fight for their own homeland, then what purpose did she have for them? Luckily for her, there were those that agreed with her mentality within Germanic society, who intended to go out with a last stand against an enemy that even the Alfheim Dominion feared. This mentality of do or die was rare in the galaxy. Most, if not all, species would agree with Hans's decision to take the best of their society and flee to a safer region of space, but not Lunaria. She could not help but get excited at the idea of her warhounds fighting against all odds, against a superior opponent, hoping that at the very least they could inflict a mortal wound upon their foe with the death of their civilization. If not for the fact that the Svartalfheim Federation was now pressing on her borders, she would be more than happy to dispatch her own forces to aid the Germanic Star Empire in their heroic last stand. However, she simply could not afford to do so at the moment, and thus she could only admire the resolve of men like the Grand Admiral and the High General, which she was quick to voice, much to the chagrin of the Supreme Leader. While I am more than willing to spare a few corvettes to safely escort your people to Alfheim, I can't help but admire the resolve that your military has. I must say, few species would be more willing to die in battle rather than flee in cowardice. It is a shame that such a valuable asset will be reduced to nothing. But make no mistake, I shall host what remains of your species here on Alfheim until a time when you can reclaim your lost territory. As for how you rebuild, that will be up to your discretion. Though Hans did not take kindly to Lunaria's comments about his actions being one of cowardice, he still forced a smile and bowed his head respectfully to the Alfheim Empress before ending the call. I thank you for your benevolence. When we return to the position of power we once held in the galaxy, I assure you that we will do everything in our power to repay the favor we owe you. Having said this, the call ended, and Lunaria could not help but scoff before voicing her true thoughts aloud, knowing that nobody was around to hear her. At that point, only the cowards among your race will have survived, and without a doubt it will affect your gene pool. If that is the case, then I will have no use for the dregs that you will become. Instead, my thoughts and prayers are with those brave men, who stay behind, knowing that they will die horribly against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with. While the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire was doing everything in his power to begin the evacuation of those he considered being essential to the reconstruction of his great society, Grand Admiral Alarico Emrys and the High General Hermann Hartmann were busy preparing for the eventual invasion by the Naraka Hive fleet. Every aspect of society was being diverted to the war effort. Reservists were being called back into active service, fortifications were being built, and new weapons were being manufactured. In 3 years' time, the Germanic Star Empire planned to increase the total number of fleets under their command from 100 to 150. In order to man these new fleets, they had not only recalled all reservists to active duty, but they had also lowered the age of conscription to 16. Meaning that now high school students were being called to serve in the ranks of the enlisted. Naturally, society had begun to speculate why such drastic measures were being taken, to which the Grand Admiral announced to the public his plan to expand the borders of the Germanic Star Empire, via the invasion and annexation of its neighbors. Of course, he conveniently managed to leave out the information regarding Terminus. Though the Germanic Star Empire had begun the mobilization of its armed forces to conquer their neighbors, they did not intend to incorporate these other worlds and species into the empire. In reality, Alaric intended to vassalize these civilizations, and use them as a buffer, to hold off the Naraka Hive fleet Terminus for as long as possible. Thus, at the moment, Alaric was in a conversation with the High General of the Imperial Army, a man named Hermann Hartmann, as he discussed his plan to lower the training restrictions on active duty servicemen. By now, the technology we have to simulate combat is so advanced that there is not nearly as much need for practical training. To put it simply, I do not intend to waste 2 years putting my starfighter pilots, who have just graduated from the academy, into dedicated flight schools. These men should already know how to pilot a starfighter long before they enter active service, and all they really need is a crash course to become accustomed to the real world. I am doing the same for all combat-related fields in the Navy. Thus, I suggest you follow my example, and lower the time required to complete specialized training programs. With this, we may be able to increase the number of active duty officers deployed to combat zones, which will be required if we wish to establish a proper buffer zone before the Naraku arrive. Surprisingly, Alaric did not receive any argument from Herman, who simply nodded his head in agreement before expressing his thoughts on the matter. I completely agree. Now is not the time to ensure that our soldiers are the most proficient in their tasks as they can possibly be. Rather, now is the time to ensure that we have bodies on the battlefield. Men who are already experienced in combat by the time the Naraku arrive at our borders. Thus, it is my recommendation that effective immediately we have on-the-job specialized training. With the heads of the two military branches in agreement on this matter, there was nothing standing in their way from changing the current training standards. And though this may result in a decrease in overall proficiency among their soldiers, it was not by much. In return for this concession, the Germanic Star Empire would be able to churn out new officers and enlisted personnel significantly quicker than before. Months passed since Eric first won the tournament, and finally the day for his graduation had come. By now he was already aware that the extended flight school was cut from a 2-year program to 3 months. In fact, every cadet was made aware of this change the moment it was announced. Not only would Eric be going to the most elite flight school in the Empire, but he would be graduating at the rank of lieutenant while serving in the elite Black Sun Squadron. He had been informed of this reality only 2 weeks ago. And while every other member of Eric's graduating class had invited their families to attend the event, Eric himself was left alone. This did not matter to him too much because as the top student, he was commanded to give a speech to his peers, something he did not wish for his mother to see, in fear that he might bungle it. After spending the morning sitting through the initial stages of the graduation ceremony, Eric now stood on the stage, at a podium, where he began to recite the speech he had long since prepared for his graduating class. Today is a day that we all must celebrate. Our youth is behind us. And now that we are men, it is our duty to protect the Empire from the infinite number of threats which lie beyond our borders. War is a part of our people's history, going back to the days of Earth, where for millennia we fought tooth and nail against an entire world for our place upon it. Violence is in our blood. It is part of our nature, something which no Germanic man can deny. Thus, it is fate that as we take our first steps into the world of men, we must also take up arms to defend our homes and our families. Some of you, like myself, will go on to serve in combat roles, while others will be supporting those of us who must kill for our great race. Whatever position you find yourself in, remember that you are a soldier in the Empire's military, and must conduct yourself with the honor and dignity that we as a species admire above all else. Glory to the Empire. Glory to Germania. The crowd broke out into applause after hearing Eric's speech, where he proceeded to accept his diploma before stepping down from the stage and entering the crowd of cadets which had gathered below. He waited for each man to receive his diploma, where they proceeded to celebrate by throwing their caps into the air. After which, someone he thought he would never see again in his life approached Eric. At first, the young man believed his eyes were deceiving him, until the beautiful woman wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him on the forehead. Eric, my baby boy, I am so proud of you. I wish I could have given you more support this past year, but your father has been keeping a close eye on me. I barely managed to make it to your graduation without him noticing. It shames me to admit that I can't stay for much longer, but I just wanted to let you know that even after everything you did, Mommy still loves you, and is supporting you from behind the scenes. After saying this, Krista disappeared into the crowd as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Eric to wonder if he had actually seen his mother, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. If not for the fact that he still felt the wetness of his mother's lips on his forehead, then Eric would have no proof that the woman had really come to see him. But this was neither here nor there. For by the end of the day, Eric would be shipping off to the 13th Fleet, where he would begin his on-the-job training with the most elite Special Forces squadron the Imperial Navy had at its disposal. Chapter 20, Black Sun Squadron. That evening, Eric and his friends had begun to say their goodbyes. Over the last 2 years, these young men had known and supported each other through their daily lives in the academy. Thus, they had gathered after their graduation at their favorite cafe, where they each drank the daily limit of beer they were legally permitted to consume. With bitter expressions on their faces, the friends exchanged information about where they were headed to now that they had officially begun their mandatory military service. Eric was the first to voluntarily speak about this matter. Well, I'm off to the 13th Fleet to serve with the Black Sunday. What about you guys? Where are you headed? Carl took a large swig from his beer before wiping the foam from his mouth. He was not surprised in the slightest that a pilot as capable as Eric would be serving among the elite ranks of the Special Forces, and was thus quick to congratulate the man while giving him some particularly juicy information. Congrats, man, after all the hard work you have put through, you earned it. I am also headed to the 13th Fleet. Though I will not be on board one of the carriers like you, instead I will be stationed in the engine room of a destroyer. Who knows, maybe if I prove myself capable in the coming years, I will be transferred to serve on board your carrier. Unlike Eric, Carl and the others were all in support roles. Carl was an engineering officer, while Dolph was a tactical officer, and as for Frederick, he was a bridge officer. Dolph was surprised that two of his friends had been sent to the same fleet, to which he was quick to lament his own position. I'll be serving on a fucking frigate in the 25th Fleet, which, in case you bastards don't already know, that means that I will primarily be stationed on Vinland. All three of the other men grimaced when they heard this news. Vinland was a tundra planet, or one nearly inhospitable to life, with only scarce mosses growing. And while the Germanic people were heavily resistant to the cold, it was still not ideal for any of these men who had spent the last 2 years in a reasonably warm climate. Eric could only laugh as he heard his friend's position, before reminding him just how badly he had it. Yeah, well, it could be worse. You could be sent to the 13th Fleet, which isn't stationed on any single planet. We literally roam the borders of the Empire looking for things to fight, and that's when we are not deployed to an actual war zone. I will spend the next 20 years of my life primarily in space. As for Carl, he is lucky that he is an engineering officer, because he only has to serve 8 to 10 years. Carl shook his head when he heard this. Naturally he was made aware of this information, when he was informed of which unit he would be serving with. To think that the two of them would spend the next decade or more of their lives in the vacuum of space. It was truly lamentable. While Eric, Carl, and Dolph were all competing for who had it worse, Frederick was laughing at the miserable bastards. Not only was he a bridge officer, which was the least likely role to result in a casualty, but he was also stationed in the best fleet of them all, which he was quick to brag about in a particularly loathsome way. You're all going to hate me for this, but take a guess which fleet I have been assigned to, and what type of ship. Eric could already tell by the smug look on the man's face that he had gotten a pretty comfortable position, and thus he gave his best guess, one which he thought was damn near impossible to be correct. I'm guessing that you have been assigned to the First Fleet as the bridge officer on a carrier. Frederick was quite surprised to see Eric guess correctly, and was quick to ask just how the man had found out. How the hell did you know? All three of Frederick's best friends immediately exclaimed in disbelief and had practically pulled the man out of his booth and assaulted him in an act of fury. What? No fucking way. You miserable cunt. How? How did you get that position? Fuck you. What did this mean? Well, the First Fleet found itself stationed on a world smack dab in the middle of the Empire that was known to be a tropical paradise. It was called Teutonia. Not only was the world a comfortable deployment, but the fact that Frederick was the bridge officer on board a carrier meant that the entire fleet would be protecting his ass, giving him a secure and comfortable position, even when sent into combat. Frederick merely laughed at his friend's misfortune, while basking in his own good luck, and continued to do so for the remainder of the time they had together. However, when the hour struck 6 in the evening, the four men shook hands, saluted, and then said their farewells. With Eric in particular looking back on his life at the university with fondness. Well, gentlemen, it has been fun. But all good things must come to an end. I hope to see you all alive and well in 20 years. If I should receive a permanent death fighting against the Empire's enemies, then all I request is that you pour a liter for me in respect for the fallen at my funeral, even if though there likely won't be a body to bury. The three men agreed to Eric's request before bidding farewell, where each of them boarded a different transport ship, all bound for the vessels they had been assigned to. After saying his farewells, it did not take Eric long to arrive at the 13th Fleet, where he and the rest of the new recruits reported to their duty stations. During times of peace, the Empire's naval structure was split into two different categories of fleets: roaming fleets, and stationary fleets. A roaming fleet was exactly what it sounded like. It was tasked with roaming the borders of the Empire, and eliminating the enemies which managed to find themselves within their borders. While stationary fleets were dispatched to the 36 star systems of the Empire, and remained within the system as a part of its defenses. Considering the Empire was currently mustering its strength for war, the 13th Fleet had been assigned to an armada of 9 other fleets, all of which were currently located in this one-star system on the fringes of the Empire. Each fleet is composed of well over 100 warships. In addition, there were several support ships which were attached to the fleet as well. Meaning that at this moment, there were over 1,000 naval vessels currently within the space of this system. Despite the overwhelming size of naval power located within this system, Eric quickly found his way to the carrier which he was assigned to, where he quickly made his way to his living quarters. After finding the bunks where the starfighter pilots slept, Eric tossed his duffel bag into his personal quarters, before being introduced to the rest of his unit. One man in particular, who appeared a bit too muscular to be a pilot, was quick to greet the newest member of the Black Sunday. He was dressed in a solid black flight suit, whose only color was the red, white, and black flag emblazoned on his right biceps. This was strange to Eric, who was certain that the flight suits of GSE pilots were a dark gray, not a jet black. "Oi, Silver, are you the new lieutenant?" When Eric heard his old nickname, which was a reference to his hair and eye color, he knew that the term his old classmates had used to mock him had just become his call sign. Thus, with a heavy sigh, he nodded his head and saluted the large man who wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander. "Yes, sir." Despite what Eric had initially thought, the lieutenant commander simply chuckled and patted Eric on the back before assuring him that he did not need to refer to him so formally at a time like this. "Relax, kid, you're in the Starfighter Corps now. We tend to be a lot less formal than the rest of the cunts in the Navy. I'm Totenkopf and I've been ordered to help you get accustomed to your new starfighter. Get dressed in your flight suit, and meet me in the hangar bay ASAP." Eric instinctively responded in the affirmative, just like he had done mere seconds before. "Yes, sir." After saying this, Eric found a jet black flight suit, just like the one that the Totenkopf was wearing in his cot, along with a helmet, and a life support system. He quickly adorned everything he needed to pilot his new starfighter, aside from the helmet, which he held beneath his arm as he sprinted to the flight deck. Upon entering the flight deck, Eric noticed a variety of starcraft. Whether they were fighters, bombers, interceptors, or perhaps even gunships. The carrier managed to hold hundreds, if not thousands, of ships inside its interior. All the ships, except for a select few, were painted in a dark gray. Those that weren't were the ships of the Black Sun Squadron, which were painted in a solid jet black. Thus, it was easy to navigate to the proper area, where he saw the lieutenant commander waiting for his arrival. Eric quickly attached his helmet, whose visor was as black as the flight suit, before climbing into his cockpit. Though he had no way of knowing it, the moment he equipped his helmet, a blood-red holographic projection of a skull appeared on his jet-black visor. This was a feature that only Special Forces squadrons had attached to their uniforms. Eric could hear the voice of the lieutenant commander whose call sign was Totenkopf call out to him, as he asked the recruit if he was accustomed to piloting this particular starfighter. "Are you familiar with the controls of an interceptor? These bolts are extremely fast, more so than your standard dagger. They also have stealth capabilities, so it would be best if you started off slowly." Eric had limited experience training with the interceptor known as the Bolt. Like Totenkopf had said, it was capable of breakneck speeds, and was designed to intercept and eliminate enemy starfighters and bombers before they could reach the fleet. But he was a capable pilot and was quick to acclimate to the sudden change in his environment. After receiving permission to take off, the two interceptors took to the space outside of the fleet, as they conducted a few drills. Despite being a fresh out of the academy, Eric piloted his starfighter in a way that impressed even Totenkopf, who called out to him over their comms with a hint of shock in his tone. "Goddamn, you're a natural, Silver. I guess there is a reason they stuck you in our squadron, after all. Alright, that's enough showing off. Let's head back to the flight deck now that I know what you are capable of." Eric did not argue with the lieutenant commander, and quickly landed in the hangar bay of the carrier, where he climbed out of his cockpit, and met with the rest of his unit who had gathered to watch the recruit get schooled by Totenkopf only to be surprised at his capabilities as a pilot. In fact, the commander in charge of the squadron quickly approached Eric and shook his hand, before introducing himself with a smile on his face. "That's some damn fine flying, kid. I see now why the brass sent you to our unit. Most new recruits wash out pretty quickly, and are sent back down to the minor leagues for not meeting our standards. But if you keep that up, you will be deployed to the battlefield before you know it. I'm Commander Erwin Wolf, by the way, but these idiots just called me Wolf Sangel." Eric shook the commander's hand and introduced himself, surprised that thus far nobody had bothered to give him shit about being a mutant. "Lieutenant Eric Yeager reporting for duty, but I suppose most people just call me Silver." Shockingly, this comment made the commander laugh, but there was no malice behind his words. "I can see why. Alright, Silver, welcome to the Black Sunday. Get comfortable, because in case you have not been informed already, you have got 2 weeks to get up to speed before we go to war." This news shocked Eric, as he was informed that he would still be required to undergo 3 months of specialized training, which he was quick to ask about. "With all due respect, sir, I was informed that I would not see a battlefield for at least 3 months. What changed?" In response to this, the commander's eyes narrowed before he sighed heavily. In that moment, he revealed something to Eric with a whisper so that only the members of the Black Sun could hear him. "I'll level with you, kid. Normally you would get 2 years of flight school before ever being assigned to this unit. However, due to recent developments, that time has been slashed down to 3 months of on-the-job training. Like I am sure you are already aware. And the best way to learn while on the job is through combat. It is time to sink or swim, the Silver. Now what I'm about to say absolutely needs to stay between our unit. I don't know whether you should be thankful for your new security clearance, or sorry. There is no easy way to say this, But within 3 to 5 years, the Naraka Hive Fleet terminus will be at our borders. The politicians have already begun to abandon us, and are headed to Alfheim in search of refuge from the coming catastrophe. Meanwhile, the military has determined that we, as a species, will fight to the last man, even if it means the death of our civilization. Thus, in 2 weeks, we will be declaring war on our neighbors in order to create a buffer zone between us and the fucking bugs. Thus, your on-the-job training will be conducted on the battlefield. Luckily for you, you already appear to have the hang of things, so your odds of survival are significantly higher than most of these new pilots. Eric stared at the commander in disbelief for a very long time. What he had just been told was that the world was essentially coming to an end. That the extinction of his entire species was imminent, and that he would be on the front lines of war against the Naraku. Except this time around, he was not in a simulation. Chapter 21, Declaration of War. Life on board the carrier was not the most comfortable existence which Eric could imagine. During his years at the Naval Academy, Eric had his own dorm room, which was essentially a studio apartment with everything he needed to be happy. However, life on the carrier was entirely different. He lived out of a small bunk in a room with over a dozen different pilots. He would not only have to shower with these men at the same time, but would also eat his meals in the mess hall, which had no variety to speak of. Instead, they were designed entirely with nutrition in mind. Essentially, he had been reduced from a solitary existence to communal living in the span of a day. But humans were adaptable creatures, and the Germanic race was especially more so than baseline humans, due to the centuries of genetic enhancements which they had received, as well as those enhancements which the nanites in their bloodstream gave them. Thus, Eric had no problem adjusting to this sudden shift in his life. If there was one benefit which he received, it was that within a mere 2 weeks, he became quite friendly with his fellow pilots. The members of the Black Sun almost always referred to each other by their call signs, so much so that Eric did not even know the actual names of half of his comrades. Like he had expected, Eric was quickly stuck with the call sign of Silver, but it was no longer a derogatory term designed to insult him for his appearance. Instead, it was a name filled with the spirit of camaraderie, and as Eric continued to perform missions around the Armada, which was comprised of 10 whole fleets, and more than 1,000 naval vessels, he had rapidly earned the respect of his unit. But the peaceful days of flying escort missions and patrol operations quickly came to an end, as within 2 weeks, war was declared on a neighboring civilization. The target of the Germanic Star Empire's ire was a minor power known as the Dvrakian Consortium, which was located approximately 300 light-years away from the borders of the GSE. The species was humanoid, and in many ways resembled the mythological and biblical demons of yore. Your standard Dvrakian stood at approximately 1.5 meters tall, and had blood-red skin, large vampire-like fangs, bat-like wings, 2 curled horns, and a succubus-like tail. They also had sharp claws on their hands and feet, and long serpent-like forked tongues. Though they may appear sinister due to the myths propagated on Earth centuries ago, the Dvrakians were actually quite peaceful, renowned in their sector of the galaxy for never starting a war, and only defending themselves. And while they were somewhat pacifistic, they still kept a large military for defensive purposes. However, in the eyes of the hungry wolf that was the Germanic Star Empire, these devil-like pacifists were easy prey. Thus, after precisely 2 weeks of active service, Eric watched on the grid as the Grand Admiral declared war on the Dvrakian Consortium. Grand Admiral Emery stood on a balcony where below him were millions of Germanic Star Marines dressed in their power armor as they stood at attention, waiting for the man to give his speech. Since the dawn of our race, war has been an aspect of our lives which we have never shied away from. No, we the Germanic people embrace conflict as a matter of pride. Seldom have we ever needed to justify a war, and though I may not need to do so to my own people, there are those in the galaxy who get antsy when an upstart like the Germanic Star Empire begins expanding at the expense of their neighbors. But conquest needs no justification. It is a natural part of life. Those with strength and power expand at the expense of the weak. That is the way of the universe and always has been. Make no mistake, my brothers, our neighbors to the east are very weak. What right do they have to dwell on their many worlds, with all their resources, while we, the strong, struggle to meet the demands of our ever-growing population? Might makes right. And we, the Germanic people, do not need to justify our actions to those who do not have the strength to oppose our will. And so as of today, I, the Grand Admiral of the Germanic Star Empire, declare on behalf of our Supreme Leader, that we will be invading, and conquering the Dvrakian Consortium, so that our people have the living space which they need to survive and thrive in this harsh universe. Hail victory! Immediately after hearing this rousing speech, the millions of Star Marines who stood at attention below the balcony raised their right arms into the air as they saluted the Grand Admiral before repeating his last words back to him. Hail victory! This declaration of war was not only broadcasted across the Germanic Star Empire, but throughout the entire quadrant which the Alphaim Dominion ruled over, and while the speech Grand Admiral Emrys had given managed to rally his people to arms, it had only served as a source of anger to those civilizations who believed that a proper casus belli was needed for the declaration of war. After all, most civilizations did not believe that conquest itself was a proper justification for war. On the homeworld of the Dvakian Consortium, a beautiful young woman of the Dvakian race gazed in horror at the broadcast, which was currently being live-streamed from the Germanic Star Empire. As a minor power, they had no hope of winning a war with a regional power, especially one as vicious and violent as the Germanic race. The only hope her species had for survival was to gain the aid of their allies. Because of this, she pled to her father, who was the president of the Dvakian Consortium, to call upon his friends to support him in his hour of need. Father, you must have seen the broadcast by now, those barbarians will soon be at our gates. We do not have the military strength necessary to defend our borders from a regional power like the Germanic Star Empire. Everyone knows that those savages expand their borders through the conquest and extermination of other life forms. If we are to be defeated, then the enemy will conduct a genocide that will wipe out our entire species. You must send for aid. The president of the Dvakian Consortium sighed heavily as he listened to his daughter's concerns. He knew as well as anyone in this galaxy what kind of vicious beasts the Germanic people turned into when they went to war. They had no regard for life other than their own, and this was displayed in the brutal way in which they engaged in combat. Knowing that the survival of his species was on the line, the president nodded his head in agreement with his daughter's words, though he feared that it would not be enough to stem the tide. Very well. I will contact our allies, and request aid for the upcoming war. With this said, the Dvakian president immediately contacted the regional power which had vassalized them. Unlike the Dvakians, who appeared to be the physical incarnation of demons, the regional power, which were their masters, appeared as if they were angels. With pale white skin, long golden hair, matching eyes, and large fluffy wings. The Anichian theocracy were as beautiful and as majestic as the angels of the Christian religion. The high priestess of the Anichian theocracy had a disturbed look on her face, as she spoke to the holographic projection of the Dvakian president. Before the demonic-looking creature could plead for help, the Anichian raised her dainty hand and spoke in an angelic voice. I already know about your concerns, and I assure you that our fleets are already en route to your borders. These barbarians have dared to attack our subjects without proper cause, and thus we have no choice but to retaliate. I won't lie to you, Daxxes. Though the Germanic Star Empire is a small nation, their military strength is on par with a Tier 3 regional power. Thus, I have called upon all of my vassals to respond to this unholy attack on the faithful. However, I must warn you, the Germanic Star Empire is a direct vassal of the Alphaim Dominion, and has won many wars with civilizations more powerful than themselves. It is because of this that I cannot guarantee victory in this conflict. If worst comes to worse, you may flee to the Anichian theocracy with the surviving members of your race. This was not the news that Daxxes and his daughter, Venta, were hoping to hear. Though they were glad to receive military aid from their suzerain and allies, they realized now, after hearing the words of their master, that they would need to prepare for the worst-case scenario. While the Germanic Star Empire had begun mustering its armadas to invade their neighbors, the Empress of the Alphaim Dominion watched from the sidelines on her home world with a particularly joyful smile on her flawless face. This reaction had only caused her youngest daughter, Celestia, to react in concern. Especially after she heard her mother's words. Magnificent, aren't they? Not even a 7-nation army can hold back the Germanic Star Empire. Perhaps if they were going against a subgalactic power, and 6 regional powers, then they would be defeated. But a mere Tier 2 regional power, and their minor vassals? These fools don't have a chance at victory. Still, that was very bold of Grand Admiral Emrys, to declare war without a proper justification. Without a doubt, he has ruffled more than a few feathers among the subgalactic powers, don't you think so, my dear Celestia? Celestia stared at her mother's satisfied expression as if she were looking at a mad woman, before questioning just what was so exciting about this whole ordeal. Mother, I don't understand. Shouldn't the Germanic Star Empire be focusing on bolstering their defenses? After all, they are aware, or at least the highest echelons of their government are aware, that the Naraku are only a few years away from their borders. So why waste valuable resources in a conflict with their neighbors? Expansion seems like a foolish idea during such a time of crisis. Lunaria did not comment for several seconds before she sighed heavily, almost as if she was disappointed with her daughter for not seeing the real reason the Germanic Star Empire had begun to expand its borders. Thus she lectured Celestia with a particularly agitated tone. Because Celestia, they do not intend to actually conquer and exterminate the Dvakians, at least not yet. No. The Germanic Star Empire intends to use the Dvakian Consortium as a buffer against the Naraku. Not only will they arm the Dvakians, and train them to be more effective combatants, But they will also fortify the worlds, so that Terminus will have to slog their way through hundreds of systems of brutal combat, and thus weakening their hive fleet, until finally they have to face off against a fully rested Germanic military. Every single Dravkian will die fighting on behalf of their new overlords, thus freeing up their territory for Germanic expansion. And they will take down as many of those fucking bugs as they can. The GSE isn't just planning for their survival, but for their expansion as well. It is truly an inspiring sight to behold. After hearing her mother's wisdom, Celestia felt as if she had gained a new understanding of the Germanic people, and their goals. And perhaps Celestia was beginning to understand her mother's borderline obsession with her favorite pets. Thus, she smiled and nodded her head in agreement with her mother's words, hoping to watch how the Germanic Star Empire would manage to survive, if that was even possible. Chapter 22, Guaranteed Victory. The war had begun, and Eric quickly found himself on the front lines. Against a minor power like that Dravkian consortium, it would normally take the Germanic Star Empire a few months to achieve total victory. After all, it was not like minor powers had access to fortress worlds which would prolong the suffering that the Germanic military would have to endure during their conquest. However, because the Dravkian consortium had managed to rope their suzerain and allies into the war, it was unknown how long this war would last. In fact, it was actually a gamble on the part of the Admiralty, because if they could win the war within a year, then it vastly increased their chances of survival against Terminus, while if they failed to accomplish this objective, it vastly increased their odds of extinction. Of course, Eric did not need to concern himself with the thoughts of the Admiralty. Instead, he needed to focus on one thing, and one thing alone: destroying the enemy in front of him. At the moment Eric was in his bolt interceptor as it zipped through the combat zone, outside of the Dravkian border world, where the first armada of the Imperial Navy fought against a combined force of the Dravkian Navy and their allies. This was Eric's first time experiencing actual combat, and because of that he had so much adrenaline running through his veins he might as well be a meth addict. Of course, this was not just a matter of natural adrenaline production, but the result of adrenal stimulants which were injected into his body via his flight suit from the moment he took off from the hangar bay. There was a wide grin on Eric's face, which was obscured by his obsidian black visor, which projected an image of a bright red human skull on its surface. If the enemy were to gaze upon his appearance at this moment, they might be intimidated. Luckily for them, they could not see the frightening uniform which displayed Eric's status as a member of the most elite starfighter squadron in the Imperial Navy. Eric continued to navigate through the battlefield with masterful skill as he spotted his first target, which was chasing after an Imperial dagger. He quickly gunned his engines and shot after the hostile fighter at breakneck speeds, whereupon lining up the sights of his targeting array, Eric pulled the trigger on his joystick, thus sending a rain of laser and plasma projectiles at his opponent. The laser and plasma projectiles ate through the primitive energy shields of the Dravkian starfighter, and ignited the entire vehicle, causing it to explode in a matter of seconds. Though Eric could not see the face of the man he just killed, he felt a bit of excitement flood his heart and mind, as he was now a true veteran pilot. A voice spoke through Eric's helmet, which he quickly identified as the lieutenant commander in charge of his wing, known primarily by the call sign Totenkopf. Nice one, Silver, but make sure to watch your six. After saying this, Totenkopf fired an antimatter missile which detonated against the hull of an Anachian starfighter which was tailing Eric from behind. Seeing that he almost got shot down after only a single kill, Eric began to focus his attention on his surroundings, as much as what was in front of him, where he quickly found an enemy bomber heading towards the destroyer which Carl was stationed on. Seeing that a friend of his might be in danger, Eric gunned after the enemy bomber, and began to light up its frame with his laser repeaters, rapidly whittling down its shields until they were depleted, where he fired an antimatter missile at it. Though the enemy deployed his countermeasures, such a petty trick would not work against Eric's missiles. After all, he had the power to manipulate machines with his mind, and thus he personally guided the missile into its target with his thoughts. As the bomber exploded, Eric cheered before cursing out the man he had just killed. "Take that, you red bastard." Thinking of killing Carl, fat chance. While the battle continued to rage on above the world of Thrikles, in which Eric was a participant, the High Priestess of the Anachian Empire was sitting on her home world with an expression of disbelief on her face. It was as if the sky was falling on top of her, and she could not understand just how her enemies had managed to become so powerful in such a short amount of time. How? How is this possible? The Germanic Star Empire had surprised their enemies with a navy so large, they might as well be a subgalactic power. The Germanic Navy had 10 armadas, which were each composed of 10 fleets, each of which had a minimum of 100 warships among its ranks. A single armada of the Imperial Navy contained at least 1,000 warships, which was more than all the Anachian theocracy's vassals combined. The High Priestess had sent the entire power of her vassals, as well as a quarter of her naval strength to the world of Thrikles in its defense, And yet the Germanic Star Empire had only sent 1/10 of its naval strength, and despite this was already close to emerging victorious. Where were the other 9 armadas of the Germanic Star Empire at this moment? Well, 2 of them were guarding their borders, while the other 6 were dispatched to the Inichian Theocracy and its other 6 vassals. While the vassals of the Inichian Theocracy had sent their entire navies to the Dovrakian Consortium, they had left themselves wide open for an attack by the Germanic Star Empire. Never in their wildest dreams would they have believed that such a young upstart of a nation would have the strength to fight a 7-nation army without even breaking a sweat. It was truly maddening. While the High Priestess of the Inichian Theocracy scrambled what ships she could manage to fight against the invasion of her enemies, she immediately opened up her hailing frequency to contact the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire. However, for whatever reason, it was not Hans who answered the call, but the Grand Admiral who had declared war in the first place. This was shocking to the High Priestess, who could only assume that a coup had taken place in the Germanic Star Empire. Regardless if this was true, she needed to end this war before half of her civilization was destroyed in this foolish conflict. Call off your fleets from the Inichian Theocracy, now. Or else I will not hesitate to request support from my suzerain. This was no small threat. Normally, a vassal would only call for their suzerain's aid if they felt like the survival of their species was threatened. Judging by the history of the Germanic Star Empire, the only thing those barbarians would do to the Inichians if they successfully managed to conquer them was genocide. A smug smile appeared on Alaric's face as he spoke in perfect Inichian to the High Priestess. Of course, you were never our target in the first place. Abandon your vassal to our conquest, and we will withdraw our forces from your borders. The beautiful angel-like creature bit her lip in frustration. She could not believe that these barbarians were forcing her to make such a horrific decision. After all, the Inichian Theocracy believed that all sentient life was created in the image of their god. To abandon the Dovrakians to genocide would go against all the teachings she preached as the High Priestess of the Inichian Theocracy. Even if she personally found the red-skinned devils to be particularly hideous, that did not mean that they deserved to go extinct, and thus she was quick to make her demands, which she could only back up through the threat of her masters. I will do so, but only if you agree not to exterminate the Dovrakians like you have done to so many others in the past. If you do not agree to this request, then I will call upon my suzerain, who will certainly punish you for your wicked deeds. Alaric merely scoffed. His society was exclusively atheist and found religion to be nothing more than primitive superstition that somehow managed to carry over into the Interstellar Age. Still, the goal was not to expend their military resources in a war with a subgalactic power. Even if they might have a chance of emerging victorious, they could not replace the damage dealt in such a conflict within 3 years, which was the deadline before Terminus arrived in their sector of space. Under normal circumstances, Alaric would tell the High Priestess to suck on a fat cock simply out of the principle of the thing, but right now, he needed the Dovrakians as a buffer against a Nera coup. And, thus, he simply sighed and nodded his head in agreement, before making up some excuse that made it seem like he would keep his word. Very well, I can spare the Dovrakians. After all, I find their women to be quite attractive. They will make excellent slaves for my people's pleasure. The High Priestess looked at Alaric with absolute disgust, not because of his words. In fact, pleasure slaves were a quite common fate for species which were deemed to be attractive by their conquerors. No, what caused the High Priestess to revile in such an over-exaggerated way was because Alaric had said that he found the Red Devils to be attractive. First off, she had never heard of the Germanic Star Empire considering anyone other than their own as attractive, and the very idea that it would be those Red Devils, instead of her race filled her with fury, partially due to her wounded pride, as a race that even the Alphaim Dominion considered being exceptionally attractive. If only the Inichian Theocracy was considerably more powerful, then they too would have the privilege of being a vassal of the Alphaim Dominion. Upon seeing the look on the High Priestess's face, Alaric's lips curled into a sneer as he accurately guessed that the woman's pride had been wounded, before making a suggestion which only further enraged her. Oh? Are you perhaps jealous? Well, don't worry, your race is also quite attractive. If you really want, I suppose I can take your species as pleasure slaves as well. The nerve that this man had was enough to make the High Priestess rethink some of her religious teachings, however she forcibly calmed herself before responding to the Grand Admiral with a particularly irritated tone in her angelic voice. Do what you want with those filthy devils. We will withdraw our fleets immediately. As for how long it takes you to conquer their civilization, that depends on your ability. Alaric simply smiled before responding in a smug voice. It has been a pleasure doing business with you. After saying this, he hung up and recalled his armadas from the territory of the Inichian Theocracy and its 6 other vassals. The Grand Admiral then deployed the full might of the Imperial military into the borders of the Dovrakian Consortium, with the intent to end the war as quickly as possible. Eric shot down his 100th kill after only 3 hours of combat. Having done so, he observed the Energean warships which still remained intact spool up their warp drives, and flee from the battlefield. Where the other 6 vassals of their civilization immediately followed suit. When it finally dawned on the Dovrakian forces that they had been abandoned by their masters and allies, they felt as if all hope was lost. Still, the Germanic Star Empire had a reputation for genocide, and thus, they did not dare cease their hostilities, in fear of the consequences that awaited their species if they should do so. Thus, even though the war was now guaranteed to end in a Germanic victory, the Dovrakians would force the Germanic military to fight tooth and nail over the distance of 300 star systems in order to fully subjugate the minor power which defied their conquest. Chapter 23, The Aftermath. After the first battle where the Germanic Star Empire emerged victorious against the Dovrakian consortium, Eric immediately headed to the hangar bay to rearm and refuel, as well as repair any damage that might have been dealt to his interceptor during the battle. While standing in the hangar waiting for his starfighter to become fit for service, Eric noticed a few of the pilots from another unit who were smoking tobacco. No doubt to calm their nerves after such a chaotic event. Eric had never smoked before in his life and had honestly never expected to. After all, tobacco could seriously affect one's health, and though the technology existed to repair any and all damage which the body could suffer, he would prefer not to have to go to the hospital to seek treatment when he had inevitably developed cancer. Or so he initially thought. However, after enduring the intense stress of combat, Eric now knew why every man he had ever met took part in the disgusting habit. Thus, he slowly approached his fellow pilots, while attempting to control his jittering hands which shook as if he were a crack addict going through withdrawal. The 2 men did not even notice Eric approach them until he began to speak. However, due to the overwhelming anxiety he felt at this moment, he slightly stuttered as he did so. "Can I bummo? One of those cigarettes off? Why? You guys?" Though Eric wore the uniform of a Special Forces pilot, this was in fact his first combat mission, and because of this he appeared incredibly nerve-wracked as he approached the pilots, who served in a regular unit. Despite the difference in their capabilities, these men were as calm as one could be, as if they had already long since seen all the horrors which the universe had offered. Upon seeing that Eric was literally shaking, one of the men took pity on him, and handed him a cigarette, where he then lit the device. Eric took a long drag from the cigarette before expelling the smoke from his lungs, an act which seemed to have significantly calmed his body, as he was no longer shaking and instead was able to gain full control over his limbs once more. The man who had handed Eric the cigarette closely observed his condition and chuckled after exhaling smoke, before commenting on his unsightly appearance. "First time, huh?" Eric did not bother denying what was blatantly obvious and nodded his head thrice in silence. To which the veteran pilot smiled and clapped Eric on the back before giving him some comforting words. "Trust me, it gets easier, and judging by the fact that you are wearing the uniform of Black Sun, I'm guessing it won't be long before you become accustomed to the horrors of war. You did good out there, kid. The fact that this is your first combat mission, and you made it back in one piece, shows you have got some serious skills. But the war has only just begun, and I'm willing to bet it will be at least 3 months before a minor power like the Dovrakian Consortium is on their knees while begging us to spare their pitiful race. So, take a short break, you have more than earned it, and when the time comes to launch again, you take comfort knowing that you now have the experience to properly navigate the battlefield. Good luck, kid, you're going to need it." After saying this, the pilot put out his cigarette, and placed his helmet on his head, where he then approached the fighter that was obviously his, and climbed back into the cockpit, waiting for the next battle to begin. As for Eric, he would remember the man's words for the rest of his military career. Thus, he finished his cigarette before going back to his unit, who were busy counting their losses. The war for Dovrakia had only just begun, and yet in the first major exchange between the 2 factions the Germanic Star Empire had emerged victorious. Not only had they crushed the Dovrakian fleet, but they laid waste to their backers, in such horrific fashion, that the Energean theocracy had no choice but to withdraw from the war and abandon their vassal to their fates. News naturally spread about the might which the Germanic Star Empire displayed. This was something that shocked even the other major galactic powers. Though the GSE commonly waged war on behalf of their Alphaim masters, they had never shown up into a conflict in full force before, deploying at most a quarter of their naval forces. Yet today, the Germanic Star Empire, a recent upstart on the galactic stage, had shown power that was at the very least on par with a Tier 3 regional power, if not a Tier I subgalactic power. How they had managed to create such a powerful and vast navy in such a short amount of time, with only 36 systems under their control, even the Svartalfheim Federation could not understand. Incidentally, this performance had only further added to the tensions at the border between the Alphaim Dominion and their darker cousins. At first, the Svartalfheim Federation believed that the destruction of the Rylonian civilization had weakened their rivals in the Western Quadrant. However, the Germanic Star Empire displayed a level of military prowess that, given a few decades, could easily make up for the loss of the Rylonians. Thus at the moment the Alphaim Empress and the Svartalfheim President were in the middle of an interstellar call, discussing the border crisis which was quickly turning into a cause for all-out warfare. Lunaria's beautiful face was as smug as can be, as she boasted about the strength that her favorite warhound represented. Do you see now how powerful my little puppies are? A mere 400 years, and they are close to replacing the Rylonians. But you know all about that. After all, the last 100 wars which your proxies have fought against my loyal hounds have resulted in humiliating defeat for you. This Svartalfheim president appeared to be a rather young-looking male of the dark elven race. His skin was as brown as chocolate, his eyes a solid amber color, and his hair was as black as space itself. He did not take kindly to Lunaria's remarks, and was quick to remind her that he was not the only threat which she faced. I would not be too happy if I were you. The Hive Fleet terminus is still ravaging your territory as we speak. And since you have mustered all of your forces on my borders, that means you have nobody in your quadrant who is capable of defeating the Naraku. I wonder how many of your direct vassals will fall to the devouring swarm before you are able to deal with them. Despite the antagonistic words which the Dark Elf president had spoken, Lunaria did not seem the least bit upset, as if she knew something about the Naraku which her rival did not. This only caused the Dark Elf president's expression to sour, especially after Lunaria mocked him for his efforts to cause her grief. You think your fleets are capable of deterring me from defeating the Naraku? I'm afraid not, and while it will take some time to effectively deal with those fucking bugs, I assure you that within 3 years' time, Terminus will be dealt with. And then, you will have to deal with my entire attention. I wonder if you filthy mutts will be able to endure my wrath when the time comes to unleash shit upon you. After all, Christerius, you and I both know how efficient and corrupt your federation is, when compared to my empire. By the time my forces invade your borders, we will be halfway to Svartalfheim before your petty congress can even approve a declaration of war. You hold no power, and to sit here and threaten a sovereign such as myself? Well, it is just laughable. Perhaps I might just dispatch my dogs of war and see how they deal with the armed forces of a so-called galactic power. After all, they seem to be handling your allies well enough. Lunaria did not even give the president of the Svartalfheim Federation a chance to respond. She quickly hung up after getting the last word in, before calling up the Grand Admiral of the Germanic Star Empire. When Alaric answered the frequency, he gazed upon the beauty of the Alphaim Empress, and bowed ever so slightly as a sign of respect. Your Majesty, I must say I was not expecting your call at this time. Is everything all right? Having just boasted about her warhound's strength to her primary rival on the galactic stage, Lunaria naturally wanted to check up on her subordinates to see how their current war with the Drakian Federation, and their allies, was going. But mostly, she just wanted to congratulate them on their victory well in advance. Congratulations, Admiral, in a single battle you eliminated 99% of your enemy's fleet, and sent their allies scurrying back to their homes. If you ask me, the Inichians have always been a bit full of themselves, and it is good to see them receive a proper spanking from my most beloved pets. I swear, my mother made one comment about how beautiful their former high priestess was as a sign of respect, and all of a sudden their entire race thinks they are the most physically attractive species in the universe. It's simply delusional. But enough about my personal feelings towards those winged twats. After all, it is not my place to interfere with the lives of my vassals. Unlike those dark-skinned dregs, we light elves do not force our political beliefs on our subordinates. So tell me, Admiral, how long do you believe it will take before you have wrapped this war up, and what do you estimate your losses will be by the end of this whole ordeal? Alaric forced a smile as he heard the Alphaim Empress refer to him and his race as mere pets. If not for the ultimate power this woman wielded, he would be quick to respond to her words with some rather vulgar language. However, he was ultimately forced to swallow his pride, and ignore the words she spoke, which were an enormous insult to him and his people. Even Lunaria did not mean them that way. Because of this, Alaric would not dare deny Lunaria's request, even if she asked for some highly classified information. And thus he spoke in a calm, and rather cheerful tone as he informed the Alphaim Empress of the GSE's progress in their current conflict. It is as you say, the Drakians are entirely on their own, and while our navy is now unopposed in this conflict, for only a small minority of the enemy's ships escaped intact, they still appear to be willing to fight us tooth and nail. Thus, I believe we will be in for a long and bloody struggle. No doubt as a result of our fearsome reputation. Initially, it would take us a mere 3 months to force a surrender against such a petty foe. However, as things currently stand, we can expect at least 6 months, possibly a year, before we have landed our armies on every planet and crushed all resistance. Losses will be minimal. After all, the enemy utterly lacks the offensive capabilities to pierce the power armor which is issued to every one of our Star Marines. at least in terms of small arms, and any armored vehicles they may have will be scrapped the moment they come into contact with our own. So rest assured, we will be ready, and willing to fight the Naraku until the bitter end. And with the Dvakians as our buffer, we will be able to bleed the Hive fleet dry in brutal urban warfare, thus giving us a better chance of survival once they have entered our borders. Lunaria smiled and nodded her head in agreement with what Alaric had said, though it was a pity the war would have to last such a long time. She doubted the GSE would ever be able to convince their enemies that they did not intend to wipe out their species, at least not directly. Thus, the Dvakian armed forces would have to be utterly crushed on each and every world they owned, until all resistance was futile. With this in mind, the Alphaean Empress made one last remark before ceasing the call. Keep up the good work, Admiral, and I look forward to your inevitable victory. Chapter 24, Atmospheric Combat. The war against the Dvakian Consortium continued and, before Eric realized it, a month had passed. By now, he had participated in over 15 battles. Some were in space, while others were in the atmosphere of the habited worlds that their enemies dwelled upon. Today was no different. In fact, the entire schedule of Eric's daily life since the war had begun was a 24-hour cycle of fighting, with minimal sleep. To cope with the meager 2 hours of rest that he would get each day, Eric was pumped full of adrenal stimulants, which kept his mind and body on high alert at all times. Other than the 2-hour rest break at the end of his 20-hour shift, Eric's only reprieve was when his interceptor was so damaged that it required maintenance. During this time, he would smoke like a chimney to cope with the overwhelming stress his body and mind were forced to endure as a result of the non-stop combat. If not for the highly nutritious meals which were served on board the carrier, then Eric truly believed he might have literally died of malnutrition by now. Aside from the bland taste, the only real downside to these pre-made meals was the fact that it limited his body's need to use the restroom. While this might be practical for combat purposes, it made it so Eric did not even get a 5-minute rest to take a dump in the morning, only increasing the amount of stress that he was forced to endure. Today, the target of the First Armada's attack was a continental world, roughly the size of Mars, which housed a few billion Dvakians. For 3 days straight, the Armada had bombarded the surface of the world, and yet those troops who resided on the surface had still refused to surrender. Thus, today was the day which the assault began. As a result, thousands of landing craft were prepared to drop the Star Marines onto the planet's surface as well as the armored vehicles they made use of. As for Eric, his objective was simple: provide air support to the Star Marines. Thus, he would be forced to pilot his interceptor into the atmosphere of the planet, and engage with any atmospheric craft the enemy might have left over, as well as target anti-aircraft weaponry, and any other hostiles which High Command designated in need of termination. By now, Eric's interceptor had half of its paint scratched off. Though the bullet holes had been sealed, the pockmarks of the enemy fire which he had taken were still present on the hull of his interceptor. It was clear that the starfighter had received its fair share of damage over this last month while engaging with the enemy, and yet, the aircraft still stood proudly among the ranks of the Germanic Starfighter Corps, which continued their relentless assault on the Dvakian Consortium. Eric finished the drag on his cigarette before stamping out the smoldering device. He then took one glance at his interceptor before placing his helmet on his head. Only after he confirmed that the seal was airtight did Eric climb into the cockpit of his interceptor, where upon booting up the power, he heard a familiar voice. "You doing all right there, Silver? I know you took some heavy shots from the enemy's flak cannons, but that should not be enough to put your fighter out of commission, now should it?" Eric immediately ignited his engines. He confirmed that his shields were fully charged before launching off of the hangar deck, and towards the atmosphere of the planet, whose surface was riddled with explosions. As he hit the air, Eric responded to his wing commander's remarks with a single statement. "I'm back in the fight." To which he heard a simple snicker over the line, and nothing else. Eric then piloted his starfighter through the atmosphere of the planet, where he immediately noticed that he was locked onto by the local AA. Hypersonic missiles were launched in his direction, to which he responded by activating his countermeasures, and then, aiming the plasma cannon which was mounted on a gimbal beneath the nose of his starfighter towards the location of the installment. After acquiring his target with his sights, Eric pulled the trigger on his joystick, which sent a blast of plasma directly at the anti-aircraft weapons, which immediately ignited the missiles still stored inside, and thus causing an explosion capable of wiping out all life in a 25 kilometers radius. After emerging from the explosive blast entirely unfazed, due to the advanced nature of his energy shields, Eric got on his comms, and informed the fleet that the last of the AA installments in this sector of the planet were eliminated. "AA is eliminated. You are clear for landing." A short response emerged via the comms, before Eric saw several dozen dropships descend from space and towards the surface of the planet. "Roger that. Star Marines are inbound." The dropships released an entire company of Star Marines per vehicle, while some of them even carried tanks and mobile artillery, which immediately began to make their way through the planet's surface and towards the nearest hostiles. Eric did not watch this for long, as he flew through the skies, and towards the next location, which was marked on his sensors. The Empire employed fighters and bombers that were capable of both atmospheric and vacuum-based flight. Something which not all civilizations made use of. For example, the Dvraakian civilization employed specialty fighters for atmospheric flight, and thus, it was these aircraft which were deployed to deal with Eric as he tore through their defenses with ease. Eric immediately picked up 6 fighters inbound to his location on his sensors, to which he used his telepathy to communicate instantly with his air wing. I got 6 bogies inbound on my ass. I could use some support. Eric continued to scan the minds of his comrades, to which he received 2 responses that were in his favor. Roger that, heading towards you, 8 to 3 minutes, I'll be there in 5. Just hold on. Seeing that the enemy were now only a minute away from him, Eric decided he would have to fight them himself, and thus he gunned his thrusters to max speed as he immediately shot past the enemy fighters, before taking to the skies in the hope of gaining altitude. Dogfighting in the atmosphere was different from in the vacuum of space. While most dogfights in space made use of strafing to maintain a constant sight picture on the enemy, this was something not achievable in the atmosphere, and thus he had to use more conventional methods of attack, such as the ancient tactic of boom and zoom. In other words, an aircraft would gain altitude and speed in order to have an advantage over their enemy. Luckily for Eric, his aircraft was capable of not only gaining altitude without the risk of stalling, but it even had the ability to break orbit. Thus, he shot straight into the air, until the 6 enemy fighters who gave chase began to stall and crash towards the surface. Upon seeing this, Eric nimbly turned his interceptor around so that it was facing the enemies,